Rachel, why don't you sit over here? All right, okay, you're right, I forgot. That's all right. We've got folks coming in late, others, it's gonna be a moving. What's that?
In some ways, maybe better to sit here and then, yeah.
I didn't know you sought land use.
Property is my primary.
Well, it's certainly relevant to this.
Yeah, no, that's why I feel like it's one meeting I had. Yeah, I'm gonna. I'm gonna be at 2.
Oh. Really? I was. I made an assumption when I came here. They said, well, the green room's upstairs. And years ago, years ago, when
Are there still people up there or something?
And that way, for every hearing, if it makes you feel any better.
Yeah. That'd be perfect to grab my start.
I emailed them that when they had to do, that's the Pratt report article. Hi, Rachel. Pleasure. Do I think he'll show up?
If he shows.
Show up testify as most elected do.
Yeah, yeah.
Number 4.
Testify.
Good afternoon. My name is Cesar Perales, and I have the pleasure and the honor of serving as chair of the New York City Charter Revision Commission in 2018. Well, I'm about to introduce the other commissioners, but let me just make a couple of opening comments. As you know, the Charter Revision Commission was appointed by Mayor Bill de Blasio. Mayor de Blasio, like other mayors before him, felt strongly that there was a need to examine the entire city charter. He had a particular interest, and that was to see if there are ways of expanding democracy in our city. And that's not just limited to the way elections are conducted, but it also goes to the issue of community boards and other vehicles that exist for citizens to express their views to our government. We've held hearings in each of the 5 boroughs. We've had neighborhood hearings. We're going to continue to hold hearings, but we wanted very much to have an opportunity to discuss the issues that have been raised at these community hearings with experts. And so today, we will be having expert testimony, an effort to educate the members of the commission, to give the members of the commission an opportunity to ask questions. The theme is community boards and land use in New York City. We will have one more expert forum, if I can use that term, on Thursday, and that forum is going to relate to civic engagement and redistricting. The meeting is being live streamed. A record is being made. We obviously have a sign language interpreter, and there is a lot to cover today. So with that, let me ask the commissioners, I'll start on my right with Kyle and ask him to introduce himself.
Good afternoon. I'm Kyle Bragg. I'm Secretary Treasurer of SEIU 32BJ, and it's been an honor to serve on this commission.
Good afternoon. Carlos Shasura,
I serve as secretary of the commission, currently serve as president of the New York Building Congress, and prior to that ran the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce, and before that served as chief of staff to Borough President Markowitz, where I actually oversaw community boards and land use. So I'm excited to be here, and a former Community Board 11 member in Brooklyn.
As I indicated, my name is Cesar Perales. I am a former deputy mayor of New York City. I more recently served as Secretary of State of New York. I have a long history in government, both at the federal, state, and city levels. And I'm an attorney who spent much of his career doing civil rights work, including voting rights and other efforts at democracy.
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Goudsell, and I'm the vice chair of the commission. Honored to be working with everyone here. I'm a law professor at Rutgers Law School. My primary area of interest and teaching is property, land use, and environmental justice. And prior to entering academia, I spent years as a lawyer, largely working on environmental justice issues and land use and environmental issues, including working with Brooklyn community activists in East New York and Williamsburg and others to challenge the incinerators that were being sited there, as well as writing a great deal of my work on issues of affordability and gentrification and ways to protect community interests and protect against displacement in communities on issues of gentrification. Prior to this, my only other work in city government was as the chair of the Rent Guidelines Board for 2 years from 2014 to 2015. I just want to say and apologize. I have a meeting that I have to go to at 2, so I feel awful. This is my area of greatest concern, and I'm so excited to hear from all of you. So I will be physically absent for a period, but I will listen carefully to everything you say in live stream. And again, I'm so grateful for all of you here contributing all of your expertise. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dale Ho. I work at the American Civil Liberties Union, where I am the director of the Voting Rights Project there, which primarily focuses on trying to ensure equal and open access for everyone to voter registration and the ballot box. I also, unfortunately, have to leave a little bit early this afternoon, but I also assure you I'll be watching the stream when I get an opportunity to do so, and I'm very grateful for everyone's participation and attendance today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Marco Carrion. I currently serve as Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Community Affairs, and in that role, I do a fair amount with both community boards and land use issues. So I'm very interested in hearing what folks have to say today. So thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aneta Citroen, and I am the Executive Director of Chaya Community Development Corporation when I'm not doing this.
I'm about to introduce Matt Gawab, who's our Executive Director, and who will briefly state the ground rules for today.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So before we begin, just a very, very brief background on community boards for those who may be unfamiliar, though many of you are. For each of the city's 59 community districts, the borough president appoints up to 50 community board members for staggered 2-year terms, and at least half of these appointees must be nominees of city council members. Established by the charter, community boards' functions derive from a range of authorities, including state law, the charter itself, the city's administrative code, and the rules of the city of New York. Although the role of community boards is advisory in nature, they play an important role in many governmental decision-making processes, allowing communities to share their views on matters of public importance. Thus far, this commission has heard many comments from the public regarding community boards, particularly regarding the appointment process, the potential use of term limits, and the availability of resources to the boards. So, Mr. Chair, for the ground rules, we'll have each of the panelists make statements of about 5 minutes. When there's 1 minute remaining, I will give you a 1-minute warning. I'll let you know. Then we'll conduct a very brief Q&A after each speaker with questions that are particular to that speaker, and a longer and broader Q&A session after all of the panelists have spoken. So again, because we have a lot of speakers and a lot of material to cover, we are asking that after each speaker, the Q&A focus only on clarifying and understanding what that particular speaker has said and saving broader questions to the end.
Great. Let me begin by introducing the members of our first panel. The first panel will be joined by Scott Stringer, the city controller. He should be here in a little while. I have Elena Conte, Director of Policy at the Pratt Center. Ebenezer Smith, the District Manager, Community Board 12. Shah Ali, Board Member, Community Board 12 in Manhattan. Mai Fong Chung, Land Use Chair, Community Board 3. Rachel Bloom, the Director of Public Policy at the Citizens Union. Sam Mgadi, Professor Emeritus at Hunter College Urban Policy and Planning Development. And with that, I will begin. I suspect I should follow this order. So let's begin with Elena Conte. You have your mic?
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Elena Conti. I'm Director of Policy at Pratt Center for Community Development. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you all today. I am as interested in the conversation that's going to ensue than in giving any particular remarks, especially with regard to community boards. Because I have to say, you know, what I'm offering today is based out of my decade experience at the Pratt Center for Community Development, where we work with community-based organizations on land use and other planning issues, and my 5 years previous experience for a community-based organization in the South Bronx. And so what I'm offering today are not specific recommendations on behalf of my organization, but general thoughts and reflections about the role of community boards in this process and some key issues that I wanted to sort of flag for your attention for further discussion. So I think the first key point that I wanted to make is that when we think about the function of community boards, we often narrowly immediately go to their function in the land use review process. And of course, land use is an important and essential role of community boards in their consideration of applications. But a theme that you'll hear me talk about now, as well as in the second panel on land use, is that planning is much more than land use, and community boards should be much more than land use. They are there to represent the community, serve as a vital link between marginalized communities and government, and vice versa. And they should be the place that helps people understand the relationship of their local conditions to systems and structures. And as such, they should be a place of access, of education, and of debate. And boards, as they're structured in the city, have this great potential. I think we would be hard pressed to find folks that feel that they're currently living up to that potential. And I think part of the considerations or concerns around that are related to their questions of representation are often seen through the lens of how the boards will interact with the land use process. So obviously the promise of a board's mission can't be fulfilled without adequate representation, and that includes especially a place for emergent voices of marginalized communities to be represented. They should be able to reflect demographic changes sooner than the political establishment and not the other way around. There should be standardized rules and requirements for representation that allow for flexibility, but that actually ensure that there's an alignment of who is living in the community and working in the community and who is active on the board. And part of that may include having pathways to join boards that are not dependent on vetting by the council member or the borough president, right? So if this is supposed to be the first place of democracy, right, the quasi-governmental structure where neighborhood meets government, there should be mechanisms that allow for folks to access that space, learn and grow in that space, develop leadership in that space, but most importantly represent folks that are new to the community or not already deeply embedded in the power structures of the community alongside with those who might. And I would say that the strongest argument against imposing some type of limit on the term that members can serve that I've heard is about the citizen capacity that gets developed over many years of serving, right? And I think it's an important consideration, right? How well community boards are supported to do their work. Obviously, boards are understaffed and don't necessarily have the structure that can support this vision of an educational place of debate and real engagement in the depth of the issues that are before the boards. And so to address that, I think the answer is in supporting a professional planning staff. And that means not just folks who understand land use, but who have a fluency in issues beyond that, who have a keen understanding of the interconnectedness of issues at the community level, both how land use relates to that, but how the structures and systems and policies of the city interact there, and where that board sits in the ecosystem of the larger city.
We have about 1 minute remaining.
Okay, thank you. Not wanting to allow for any of those points to have gotten muddled, perhaps I will summarize in the following, is that there absolutely needs to be a more systemized way to address representation in community boards, because even though there have been recent reforms, it's still largely at the discretion of the borough presidents and the council members, and there isn't a consistency that encodes what our aspiration is for representation at the boards. There needs to be increased staffing support for the boards in and beyond land use, so that the boards can manifest their vision, work in harmonious ways with existing community-based organizations, and really be this portal of link to the neighborhood. And that creating pathways for there to be turnover and the development of new leadership on the boards is of paramount importance if we're going to truly realize this function. So thank you.
Thank you. Just a very quick question from me. I'm somewhat confused. It seems to me that there may be some conflict, and you're saying you are not supportive necessarily of term limits, and yet you do want to see turnover, and you do want to see rapidly changing communities represented by the people in that community. How do you respond to that?
Thank you for your clarifying question, Chair Paradas. That would be an instance of the muddling of the point that I feared took place. So I am in favor of term limits for community board members. It got confused with the point that the strongest argument against the point that I am making, which is being in favor, is that folks develop a capacity. And I think that that capacity should be ongoing and supported by staff. So thank you for that clarifying question.
What else with questions? With that, we want to move along very quickly. Shah Ali, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to the commissioners, and thank you to the commission for the courtesy of letting me go out of order. I have to return to work. I'm an attorney by day and an attorney by night, and I have to go, and I have court at 2 o'clock, which segues perfectly into that community boards are volunteers. But whenever there's an ask to help, my answer is always yes, because I think that is our moral obligation to help one another. And I love community boards. I think community boards are absolutely necessary. Any charter revision should only be made to strengthen the uses of community boards. I'm the chairperson of Manhattan Community Board 12, which covers the dynamic neighborhoods of Washington Heights and Inwood. I'm sure I'll get in trouble by saying this to Commissioner Carrion, but Washington Heights 12 is the best community board in the city. I'm slightly biased, but you know, why not? Why not say it? I love community board so much that I wear it on my chest. I think the chair said, on my heart, I wear the community board. We should do everything to strengthen the use of community boards. Community boards are our closest level to democracy. I've asked several times as chairperson, what can we do to get more involved? I say go to community boards. You go to a community board meeting, if you withstand a community board meeting, you will understand the issues of your community, and you will come out of there with one good idea. Community boards are the incubators of ideas. The executive director laid out the functions of the community boards, the formation of community boards. I encourage everyone to read section 2800 of the charter to understand community boards. The role of the chairperson, I say it's two functions. One, your CEO, one, your chair leader. You promote the work, the good work you're doing in your neighborhood. You also run the functioning of your particular board. There are some challenges that boards face, and this revision offers that opportunity to address those challenges. I'm particularly excited by this topic that is of community boards and land use. When asked now, what are the three topics that Community Board 12 is facing? I'll say land use, and I forget the third, because we are dealing with land use. Community Board 12 is dealing with the inward rezoning, which is the fifth, I believe, in the city. And we just went through our EULA process, which is, again, another area that Community Board 12 did a good job in. But there's also some work that could be done in strengthening our position. We are advisory. I think everyone gets that. But we have something much more powerful than just the advisory role. We have the power of persuasion. We have the power of the people. Even though someone tells me I'm advisory, I say, look, we have the power of the people. The power of the people is never advisory. We give our roles. The way I started on a community board was the quintessential issue. If you ask anyone about community boards, the two issues that will span the entire city that everyone complains about is noise and dog poop, right? Noise and dog poop. I was awoken one night and I said to my wife, I wish someone would do something about the noise from the local bar. And she said, well, you could wish someone else would do it, or you could do it yourself. 5 years later, fast forward, I'm chairing the board. So the joke's on her or the joke's on me. In terms of democracy, every member of our community has the right to be at our community board meetings. They're open to the public. What I remind people is that you don't have to be a member to be involved. You show up. 80% of success is showing up. I do believe that we could empower boards more by giving more resources meaning money. We have our district manager. Our district manager of Community Board 12 is Ebenezer Smith. We have a staff of 3, and they handle everything. We have 10 subject matter committees on Community Board 12, and at any given time, all 10 are important to those who want to advance that role. If we increase the staff by increasing funding, then we've increased the ability to handle constituent complaints. We'll have topics that we have to deal with, which are heavy, like affordable housing, which I'm not sure we can answer, or we're missing a garbage can on the street. And if we're able to succeed with that, then we've done something for the community. I do believe that the appointment process could have a little bit of work to it. I'm not sure what the other option is. I can tell you that our members of Community Board 12 are absolutely independent, regardless of who appoints them. Term limits are another issue. Each term is 2 years. I think it takes a couple of years to try to figure out how to write a resolution, how to understand city government. But I also don't think you need to be on the board 30 years either. There is some merit to institutional knowledge, but there's also merit to a new voice. And I do respect a good time limit as chairperson. So I'll wrap it up by saying that the end product of all the testimony you should have is not to minimize or to keep the powers of the community board, but to increase it as well. One of the success stories we had in Community Board 12 was that we saved a supermarket. We were able to save a supermarket from being closed. And that started with someone saying, you have to save our supermarket. So the power of persuasion, the power of the public is real, and it belongs and it lives at community board level. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me just quickly get to a question. We are pressed. Commissioner Una Clark will introduce herself in a moment. The question that came up at our community hearings had to do with the lack of capacity for land use. As you pointed out, it's land use, and whatever you forgot. And that is a major issue with lots of people. You as a chair of community board, what is your response to that?
We certainly could use an independent land use expert. Land use is one of these things that is highly technical. You can't sort of like fake it until you figure it out. Someone who understands the steps, certainly the EULA steps, would be highly valuable. I think appointments should be made of members with specialization, with certain expertise. We have folks in our board who are experts in this area and they're valuable. But the scary part to a chair is without that mandate for them to be there. So if they're absent one day, we're without the expertise. So that from an institutional point of view is absolutely scary. If we have someone who is a salaried employee, then there's a reliance that that person is there. I can turn to that person. I'm not an expert. I turn to that person and say, I can ask the questions. Are we doing the right thing? And we have that person to answer. So I think you need to put someone on staff.
I'm sorry to be late. I am Una Clark. I'm a former member of the New York City Council, and I'm a trustee for the City University of New York, and I'm pleased to serve on the commission.
Question? Kyle?
Good afternoon, Mr. Ali. Thank you for coming here and testifying before the commission. I failed to mention, but I am a committee board member of Committee Board 13 in Queens. And I'm interested in hearing from you again your thoughts on term limits. I think that my particular community board might be an exception versus the rule in regards to diversity representation in the community that which we represent. And I'd like to hear from you about your feelings on term limits so that we can ensure continued diversity and representing an ever-changing population in those community boards, and also the turnover of leadership, your opinion on that, and not only diversity of culture, but diversity of age. We have a lot of young folks who have been excluded from the opportunity to serve on community boards because of the current rules on how they're appointed, and I'd like to hear your opinion on that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Each board has 50 volunteers. Community Board 12, we just received 10 new appointments. So at one point, 20% of our board are new. So my opinion is that we need a term limit that, I actually favor term limits, but the middle ground is between term limit, no term limit. What is that term limit? Long enough to allow someone to actually understand the scope of the work that they're doing, but not so long that they're riding on laurels of, I've been here for 20 years, so that's what I'm going to rest on. What we've recently started doing is, and I've answered the most honest way I could when reappointments happen every 2 years. What I've told my members is it's never personal, it's business. You have to earn your reappointment. So even if you've been on the board 20 years, but you've done nothing to earn that reappointment, I cannot support you. And we've actually had 2 folks removed for that. So I would say we have to find that magic number between you've only been there 2 years, you don't know what's happening, versus you've been there too long. And I don't know what that looks like, but it might be 5, 6, 7 terms. While I do believe institutional knowledge is great, and it is great, a different voice also could be. So maybe staggering how appointments are made, but I'm absolutely in favor of term limits, and I'm happy to see or encouraged to see that's being discussed. The turnover of leadership, I'm of the belief that you don't need to be on the board X number of years before you're put into leadership. I'm of the philosophy that if you put someone in leadership, they will respond to it. So I've recently appointed people who've been on the board for 6 months, a year, into leadership positions, because we all come in with subject matter expertise. We don't leave our expertise at the door. In fact, we want to have experts on the board. So it would be a shame, it would be a missed opportunity by any chair not to identify the experts that are coming in and putting into leadership positions. So you could be on the board for 30 days. I will identify how we can extract your leadership abilities and put you into practice. So again, that answer has to be, do we have a chair who understands that? So our chairperson has to understand it. In terms of diversity, we absolutely have to diversify and make sure that our boards reflect the composition. In Washington Heights and Inwood, we're balancing a lot of different plates. Someone asked me when I went to run for chair, how could you possibly run for chair in a district that's 60% Hispanic? And I'm Indian. And I said, well, why not? Because diversity helps everybody. So I think we need to promote it, and it has to start from the top, coming down. Our board president, our council members have to say we need to diversify, reflecting our population, diversifying, reflecting the thoughts and cultures of our neighborhoods. And I hope that answers.
Seeing no more questions, I will move immediately to Ebenezer Smith, who will continue to talk about Upper Manhattan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. As a district manager, I am responsible of the implementation of the day-to-day work of the community board, as directed by the executive committee and the resolutions passed by the board. So I am responsible for make happen everything that the board wish to happen. And it's not an easy job because sometimes you have requests coming from board members or chairs of the committee that are not according with the reality of the city functionality. As a district manager, I am a city employee, and I need to deal with the city charters and on the city agencies and work as the city agency works. I define my job, I need to be like an ambassador and deal with a lot of diplomacy between the community board, and the city agencies and the elected officials, and try to accomplish what I've been asked to do in a meaningful way with the resources that the city agency or the organization that I have been asked to work with can provide to me. One of the day-to-day challenge that I have is find a location for a particular meeting. My chair just spoke about the inward rezoning that we had at the beginning of this year. And when we planned at the executive committee, the work with that ULUR process, I was asked, we need a location in Inwood large enough to hold 1,000 people at once. In Inwood, we don't have that location, and it has to be for free, and it has to be from 7 to the time we finish. So the only location that I was able to find was a school, a very old school that is not accessible, but it can hold, close to 1,000 people at once, and we can have it as long as we want because the relationship that we have with the leadership in that school, a former chair of the board worked there, and a former board member worked there, so they were able to help me. And the date that we decided was when the spring break, and people were upset how we managed that. And it was not accessible. Many people was outside. It was full capacity. We have to close the door at a certain point because the fire department came, you reach capacity, you cannot continue letting people in. And you have all that pressure, and you need to make things happen. And in the meantime, the board office is running, the phone is ringing because somebody has a problem with a pothole or a street light that is not working, or a lady is asking for Section 8, how can we help? I got this letter, and walk-ins, I need my immigration paper, and how you can help me. And that happened all at once in a given day. And I only have 2 people working with me, and I need to train them, how to answer, because you cannot say, I don't know. Or I tell them, anyone that comes here for help, you cannot tell what I don't know. We need to refer to a person. If you don't know, if I am not here, please take the contact information of that person. So when I come back, I can try to figure it out how to do it. And many times the directions and the demands from the board members and the executive committee are in conflict with the day-to-day operation, because if you see the city charter, the district manager is responsible to process community complaints. And when you got a complaint that I have no water in my apartment or my building, what's going on, or I have a complaint that for a landlord that doesn't provide heat, and I have a demand to put a meeting together with 2 people, if one of my staff calls sick or is not there, how are we going to manage the thing? Everything is an emergency for someone, but I am the one on my desk who had to determine this is the one that's going to go first for whatever reason. And my main emergency on a particular date is that the meeting that's going to happen today at 7 p.m. is ready with the location, with the all the information that need to be distributed, all the invitation and everything is ready for that meeting. And that takes priority at the beginning of the day, because at the end of the day, 100 people are going to come to that meeting and they need to be served.
About 1 minute remaining.
And the question also that we have for the city charter is sometimes it's very vague word that said the district manager work at the pleasure of the board. And that is misinterpreted, the pleasure of the board, what that means. And you need to serve according to the standard of the board. But sometimes the standard of the board is not the reality that the district manager job is. And you need to manage that. And the last question that I'm being asked to talk about is the time limit. It's a very complex one. It needs to be fixed in one way. You need to preserve the memory, the institutional memory, but at the same time, you need to give opportunity to new residents and members of the community to serve. I will say that probably a cap years of service will be good. How many years? I don't know, 10, 12, 14, because remember the board member, they serve in 2 years limits. It has to find a way not to apply away retroactively, maybe going forward if a cap is placed to limit the service. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question, if I might just take the prerogative of the chair, and I would hope that Ms. Fong, when she gets an opportunity to speak, she will also respond to it. The question has to do with something I asked your chair, which relates to the capacity of community boards to address the issue of land use, zoning, planning in general. Are any of your staff members expert in that area? Are you? Or how do you get any opportunity to provide support, expert support to the members of the community board on these issues?
I am a lawyer by training. I learned about Europe by reading Europe and from the city charter. And when someone asks me a question, I go by the process. I was, working for DOT before at the legal department, and I learned some part of the process for the Europe process. However, I am not a technician in land use. We are blessed at Community Board 12 that our chairperson is an architect and is an expert on land use and ULUR process. And we have well-written resolutions that we refer as that, but I am not an expert. And yes, we will benefit and from a professional in planning that be in the office working with us, and the public, the residents, will come more to the board. But sometimes we get a particular question that I need to tell this person, give me your contact information, I will call you back. And then I need to do a research in order to bring the correct answer to that person.
Thank you.
So just to clarify, so are you the only paid staff?
I have two more paid staff with me.
Okay. And then some of the responsibilities or duties you describe for you and your team seems to me are similar to what a local council member's office would address. How do you see the difference, and what would how do you see the difference in residents choosing to go to you to address concerns versus the local council member? And what is the sort of relationship in addressing issues? I'm not sure I'm being clear in my question, but it sounded like there was some overlap in roles. Yeah.
What I get from your question is how people prefer me as a district manager than the council member to go to resolve a problem. That's the question.
I mean, I hear that the role that you're playing is
very similar.
And I think that there's been some convincing arguments thus far about strengthening the community boards.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if community boards were to be strengthened, how then would that either overlap in the role that the local council members play and their offices play, or not? And what is the sort of relationship there?
Many times the council member office refer people to me to resolve the problem. And why people choose the council member to me is because the council member have a title and have more Jews political connection to resolve the matter. That's the only way I see it locally. But many often, the office of the elected official, they refer the people to me to resolve the problem. And when the new council member came to my district, the staff, they used to call me 3-4 times a day. How can I deal with this matter? How you can explain it more to me? Well, if I can resolve issues that take a lot of time for me, like if find a room to have my general meeting every month. My board wants that the meeting be around the district. I need to have a room for the capacity at least 100 people, have to be for free, and we need it from 6 o'clock to 10. But one of the problems is the meeting never finished at 10, and then when it says 10, after 10 and it finished 11:45, those persons told me, you told me that 10, what happened, and how am I gonna come back to those people right away? I need to cool down to come back and ask the room again. That is a hell of a job to find location every month. When we have a special meeting, that you need to find a location where you find that has to be free. It has to, all these requirements, accessible. The other day I got in trouble for everyone because I found a location that was not accessible, and the people defending accessible group called me they don't want it. We had to change it. We changed location 3 times, and people were very upset. Finally, we got a location that was suitable for the meeting. That is a lot of time consuming, that when a constituent call me with an issue, I need to put it on the side because at that time, I need to resolve the location of that meeting.
Are there any other questions from the commission?
Mr. Chairman, it's not so much a question like, I just want to play something out with you. While I was in the city council, there were members of the city council, especially those in Queens, who felt that the community boards just confuse their constituents as to where to go for service. So I'd like to clarify for you what issues that would come to you that you would call the council member and say, I'm sending your constituent to you because this is not an issue of the community board.
Well, when somebody wants some type of legislation or some type of change that we can able to pass that. But the day-to-day delivery of service that come to my office is getting resolved. Remember, as a district manager, I chair the district service cabinet meeting that I deal every month with the agency representative to which I have a very good connection, and I resolve issues with Parks Department, with Department of Transportation, Con Edison, et cetera, et cetera. So those issues related to delivery of service, I am very able to resolve without confusing people. But when somebody call me that they want a sidewalk cafe or they want a liquor license that according to the rules cannot be passed, and you need to change the legislation to get what they want, I need to refer them to the city council to introduce legislation.
Would you surmise, if not knowing, does each community board operate the way yours work, or you are unique in terms of your orientation towards your community and the services?
But definitely not. Each community board is an independent city agency, and all depend on the knowledge of the district manager and the chair.
Yes,
It happens that I work for Parks Department 10 years. I work for DOT 10 years, and I work for Community Board 10 years. So I have 30 years of city work that I can guide people in the direction.
that's why I ask, were you unique? And for us who are making the decision here, or who wants to make the recommendation to make sure that every community is equal in terms of the kind of interface and impact that community boards have, what would you recommend?
Well, the quality of the district manager, the experience of the district manager. If the district manager doesn't have City of New York government experience, will now be working well at any given time because they're going to be confused.
Whom do you say you're accountable to? Are you accountable to whom within the city for the kind of work that you do? To whom are you accountable? Your chairman, and your chairman to whom? How does it work?
Well, I am accountable to to my chairperson, is my immediate supervisor. Then the executive committee are the 50 board members that we are under the umbrella of the board of president. When the board of president's office indicates something, we need to follow that direction. And ultimately, we are directed by the mayor's office as well. But also, we are responsible, accountable to the community in my different sectors in my district that they demand service that I need to deliver it to them.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Let me move on to Ms. Chung. Oh, Ms. Chung, will you wait for just a moment because you'd like to hear Ms. Chung, Mr. Stringer?
Yes.
All right. Well, there's a chair at your disposal.
Thank you.
Ms. Chung, you've got the floor for 5 minutes, and then we'll ask a question or two.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, everyone on the commission, for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Mifang Chung. I am currently chair of land use for Community Board 3 Manhattan, which encompasses the Lower East Side, East Village, and Chinatown. First, I'll get straight to the point. I'm generally not in favor of term limits.
Generally, or in this particular situation?
In this particular situation, I am, for the most part, not in favor of term limits. I'll give you a little bit of background of my personal experience on the board and talk about CB3 specifically, and then why I feel the way I do about term limits. So I started serving on my board in 2010. I'm an architect. So in 2010, I was at kind of towards the beginning, middle of a very demanding career in New York City. So I was working all the time, basically. And, I basically had no time to serve on the community board, or thought I had no time. I had different priorities as a young person in New York City. So in 2010, I started serving on CB3 first as a public member. I did that for a year before I was appointed onto, not my first choice committee, but a committee that I served on and learned a lot about how important that committee was. As an architect, I had my heart set on the land use committee. And of course, the land use committee is one of the most coveted committees in any board. So I served on the transportation committee and learned so much more about communities in general, my community, and how all of the different committees are interrelated, and how you really need to establish a good working professional relationship with all 50 committee members, all 50 community board members in order to do your job, even on your specific committee. That's given the fact that the community board membership is a volunteer position, and most of the members on the board are really trying to just patch together the hours necessary to become an effective member of their community. There are already so many structural barriers to fulfilling our service. I feel like adding a term limit is another not, somewhat unnecessary barrier. And I think partly because of the structure of community boards, the fact that they're on a volunteer basis, and it's not even a job that you have the luxury of putting in like the equivalent of a part-time job. 10 or 12 years of service on a job such as the community board is not the same as 10 or 12 years of service in a publicly appointed full-time and compensated position. People are already overcoming so many barriers to serve.
But is that an argument for not having term limits? I'm not sure I understand.
I think in order to amass the not just technical, but practical expertise of being on the board, it takes longer. So because you can only put in a few hours here and there to learn a very, very complicated city process, to learn how government and agencies and electeds work together. And there's still confusion about how these different segments coordinate and work together, even among people who do this full time. I think it's vital that community board members have time enough to grow into their roles and get to know all of their fellow board members to establish working relationships and agencies and electeds that we have to work together with. I also would like to say, so after I joined in 2010, after a few more years, I was appointed onto land use and then became chair of land use. So all of this took kind of quite a bit of time to sort of to grow into the role and be comfortable in that leadership position. I think community boards provide a unique opportunity for people with different backgrounds and expertise to serve their communities who wouldn't otherwise go into public service. The fact that you don't have to campaign for this job, I think, opens it up to a much wider variety of people who don't have the disposition to, go out and socialize and glad hand and put themselves out there.
Have about 1 minute remaining.
Thanks. I think, and also I personally rely a great deal on the members of the board who have been very, very long-serving members, not just because of their life experience, but specifically their community board experience. Some of the projects that we work on take many, many years, especially the land use projects, over 10 years sometimes, to build consensus from the greater community, to push these actions through all the agencies that we need to work together with different agencies and electeds to get to enact. And it's very hard to find good candidates that are, that become good members of the board. And I feel like term limits are a very blunt tool that cuts out as many good people as it does bad. And in terms of having a process for increasing turnover and diversity, I agree diversity is a problem, and we need to make more efforts to make sure our boards represent the community, but I feel like that should happen on the front end, not the tail end in terms of, and I think that's what term limits do. I think we need to improve our outreach process, improve have a more rigorous appointment and reappointment process. So I think we already have a structure in place to make sure that boards have adequate turnover and provide more opportunity. And that's really just strengthening the process that we have today.
Let me interrupt you very quickly. 2 questions that I have. I'll exercise my prerogative as chair. One has to do with whether you would accept or advocate for term limits if you could come back on, that is, go off for a
non-consecutive, right? Well, I think that could be a good way to balance the composition. Being able to step away for 2 years could be a good way not only to open up the opportunity, but also for a long-serving member to just.
My second question goes to the one that I've asked before about capacity in terms of land use. Given your own expertise and experience, do you think that there ought to be greater capacity provided to community boards to address questions of land use?
I think we absolutely need more technical expertise, and I think it's really hard to rely on just the members themselves to provide that. I'm an architect, and I have worked on several different ULURP applications in my professional capacity, but it's different. You play a different role as an architect than you do as a community board member. And as an architect, I am versed in certain aspects of ULURP, but not in the aspect where where community boards participate. So yes, we definitely need more.
All right, I take that as a yes. Aneta?
Can you say some more about the process that you have in place to ensure turnover and that there is diversity?
We currently have 2-year term. We currently serve for 2-year terms, and then there is a reappointment process. So I think that process could be strengthened And
But does it work to increase diversity?
the reappointment process, I think that's one way it could help. Another way is to do more targeted outreach of people in the community and get the word out. And frankly, that's something that community boards need to do better in general, just to let the community know who we are and what we do. But I think like there are tools in place, and if we use them properly, that should take care of the issue of
What are some of those tools?
Like having, well, first, having targeted outreach, which is a tool that I think we haven't really explored or are using enough. I think there's a reappointment process, and that seems to change or evolve with new borough presidents. Sometimes it's an interview, sometimes it's an interactive workshop. I'm not privy to the actual decisions being made about who gets appointed and why. I understand that the board chairperson can help influence that process, but the rest of the committee members, rest of the community board members and the committee chairs, as far as I know, don't have a formal role in advising the borough president and the council members of the types of members that are needed.
Thank you, Ms. Chung. We really appreciate your testimony. I'd like to move on now to the New York City Controller and former borough president, Mr. Scott Stringer.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Perales and members of this distinguished Charter Revision Commission. Many of you I know very well, so it really is great to present to you, especially on some very favorite topics of mine, both when I was Manhattan Borough President from 2006 to 2013, and in the beginning of my political career at the age of 16, when Percy Sutton appointed me as the youngest teenager ever to serve on a committee board way back in 1977. For the record, that appointment made front page news in the New York Times below the fold. And it changed my life. Little did I know when I became borough president, I would play a role with our community boards. But I do think it's important that you convene this forum on community boards and land use. And I'm going to submit formal testimony, but if you bear with me, I just want to give you a sense of my experience when I served as borough president. The first thing I want you to know is that community boards play a central role in shaping neighborhood development and advising government on the needs and interests of our communities. I do commend you again for examining ways to strengthen and support community boards in fulfilling their mission. And I think it's important to know the history of community boards. They were originally established as community planning boards by Manhattan Borough President Robert Wagner back in 1951. And that was to conduct comprehensive community-based planning for the growth of Manhattan. In 1975, the Charter Revision Commission extended community boards citywide with 59 community boards representing the same number of districts. The Charter Revision aimed to decentralize service delivery back then and make the new community boards into what Mayor John Lindsay had called little city halls. Mr. Prowse, I think you remember that very well. And Dr. Clark, I know you know this. It ensured at the time that service delivery, such as parks and sanitation, were consistent among community boards, established for the first time district service cabinets, and officially created the district service manager position. In addition, it gave community boards other advisory functions such as budget analysis, capital need recommendations, oversight of city service delivery, and the creation of district needs assessments. When the charter laid the groundwork for local planning through the creation of ULURP and 197A plans, it really wasn't until 1989 when the charter revision back then really expanded those powers. And specifically, that charter required the City Planning Commission to actually adopt and define rules regarding the review of 197A. It did at that time give community board representatives the right to attend meetings regarding the environmental impact of proposed land use proposals, and gave boards the power to make recommendations relating to the opening and closing of city facilities. And most importantly, the new structure highlighted the role of community boards in ULURP as the local nucleus for responding to zoning changes. While the community boards had a dual mandate and many tried to focus on both service delivery and community-based planning, due to limited resources, proactive planning often took a back seat to service delivery. However, at the same time, many elected officials began to professionalize their operations going back to 1974 in the post-Watergate era. So suddenly, where the community board at that time was the service delivery agent, now you had the local assembly member with a district office, the local council member, the Congress member. You get elected to office, and suddenly you had different offices in the catchment area delivering those services. That was expanded back in 2007 with the beginning of 311. So we had to move, and we should move, community boards from service delivery to planning. And I believe we should, rather than focus on those constituent services, we should be empowering community boards to fulfill their intended role as neighborhood planning bodies. So I do think you should call these boards not community boards, but community planning boards. I think that's critical because as the current development boom reaches deeper into the boroughs, affordable housing has become increasingly scarce and our transit system is bursting at the seams. Neighborhood-based planning that takes the diverse needs of local communities into account is now more essential than ever. With community boards working as partners, the city might have an easier time passing zoning, citing shelters, and moving forward on a host of other initiatives to help our city stay fair and affordable for people who help build the very neighborhoods that they are now targets for development. Community boards, however, have historically lacked the resources, capacity, and expertise to fulfill their community planning role in a consistent, meaningful way. And that's why community board reform was a signature effort of my 8 years as Manhattan Borough President. Our vision was to restructure the appointment and training process to ensure community boards were comprised of well-qualified members and equipped with the skills and knowledge necessary to navigate the complex issues facing their communities. Our reform initiatives had positive results, and they inform my recommendations for this commission to strengthen and empower community boards. One of the central responsibilities of community boards is to enable community-based planning and make recommendations on land use. However, community boards face challenges in their ability to adequately review and analyze land use matters due to a lack of resource and expertise. Most boards do not have trained urban planners on staff and must therefore rely on their volunteer members to analyze land use proposals and develop recommendations. And yet, we expect them to argue their positions against the $800, I think it's now $1,000 an hour lawyers hired by major developers in front of the City Planning Commission. It's just not a level playing field. In an attempt to level this playing field, when I was borough president, our office created the Community Planning Fellowship Program, which at the time placed graduate urban planning students in community board offices. It was the Urban Peace Corps. The program enhanced the ability of community boards to undertake research, analysis, and mapping, allowing them to better evaluate development proposals and provide more sound recommendations. And during my time as borough president, these urban fellows created a community-based zoning proposal for the East Village in Community Board 3, analyzed residential conversion of Class B office space in Community Board 5, and helped Community Board 10 in Central Harlem update their 197A proposal. The Fund for the City of New York has continued the program in select areas, but it should be expanded to benefit every community board in the city. As valuable as this program is, it was developed as a substitute for what is truly needed, a full-time urban planner on the staff of every community board. The sole responsibility of this planner would be to support the board's analysis in developing recommendations on land use matters and to coordinate community-based planning activities. Expertise of the urban planner would better enable community boards to conduct comprehensive community planning. So I ask you today that you require that community boards appoint a full-time urban planner with a degree in urban planning, architecture, real estate development, public policy, or similar disciplines, and include the necessary budget appropriations to fund this position. A community planner would be a game changer in communities that experience extraordinary land use applications. And quite frankly, they don't have the expertise and they're at a tremendous disadvantage. Now, in addition to creating the Fellows Program, my office invested in training and continuing education for community board members. Once appointed, new members were required to attend trainings on the New York City Zoning Code, ULURP, land use actions, and planning concepts. Returning members were also encouraged to regularly attend these trainings to refresh their skills. This continuing education helped their knowledge base better prepare them for the work of the office. And I have to tell you, people couldn't get enough of Urban Planning 101, 102. People went to these courses. It was quite extraordinary. I couldn't believe people who had jobs and responsibilities couldn't wait for this. Now, communities were able to successfully advocate for meaningful changes in private developments. Some of the issues they had to tackle during my tenure was Columbia University's expansion in West Harlem, the city-sponsored developments like Seward Park Urban Renewal Area, and a whole host of different development projects, NYU expansion, Fordham University expansion. The advocacy around these projects just resulted in a better relationship between what the community needed and what these universities needed, all recognizing that skylines change, but they cannot change without our community. So based on this fruitful experience, I would ask you to think about the city requiring that we do provide training, support, and educational opportunities in all of these disciplines for community board members, and really codify this in a more holistic way, not just based on who the borough president is, but really create a 5-borough agenda in this area. That is something that I would ask you to do. And finally, it is about recruitment. We have got to do more to recruit people to serve on community boards. Now, under our administration, our outreach and recruitment strategy was comprised of 4 components: individualized recruitment plans for each community board, broad outreach to community organizations, public information sessions, and we used all forms of traditional social media to reach the public. We also examined census data for each district. This allowed our office to create targeted plans to recruit applicants, and we wanted very much to recruit diversity in our community boards. So this was something I thought was interesting. In the 2000 census, that showed that there were 3.2% of community board 3 identified as Asian American or Pacific Islander. That's 35%. Yet in 2006, only 8% of the board, or 4 out of the 50 members, were Asian Americans. This meant that the recruitment strategy for Community Board 3 needed to focus on outreach within the Asian American community. As a result of our focused approach, we were able to steadily increase Asian American representation on the board, tripling it to 24% or 12 members by 2011. We took the same approach to tackle the lack of LGBTQ representation on boards outside of Greenwich Village and Chelsea, the lack of Black and Latino representation on boards south of 96th Street, on the Upper West Side, on the Upper East Side, and by the way, almost no Caucasian representation in Central Harlem. So to ensure quality, transparency, and diversity, we want the charter to set additional standards for community board recruitment and make it possible to actually tackle diversity, which is so critical to rounding out the different opinions of communities. Now, finally, I want you to focus on the notion that we should create annual reports issued by each borough president on the composition of community board membership and strategies used to conduct outreach and recruitment. Our office not only focused on transforming the community board recruitment process, but also on reforming the appointment process. Now, community boards have historically been governed by the same appointees year after year, allowing limited room for new voices and views. Dozens of vacancies and conflict of interest among board members really presented very interesting challenges. Now, the centerpiece of what we did was the creation of an independent screening panel comprised of leaders from good government groups, civic associations, and community-based organizations. Our panel, our independent screening panel, helped to ensure the public and all who were concerned that appointments were merit-based and helped to recruit applicants from their organizations and communities, essentially serving as ambassadors to what we called community board reform. All applicants, including those who had previously served on the board, were required to complete an application and come into the office to be interviewed, effectively ending automatic reappointments. We endeavored to appoint committed candidates. We made sure that that there were no vacancies on the boards. We left very few members, very few vacancies. Our policy was to fill every vacancy in 30 days. We had a list of panel-approved candidates that met our very high criteria. We basically took the politics out of community board appointees. One of the things that we did, much to my chagrin, was this whole notion that it didn't matter who you supported for borough president, it didn't matter whose friend you were, because like the judicial selection process, if you weren't approved by the independent panel, we couldn't help you. And I will never tell you the stories of people who were not reappointed that are still mad at me today. So what was the proof of the pudding? Over 8 years, 715 new appointments were made to the borough's 12 community boards. We gave hundreds of New Yorkers a chance to participate in shaping the future of their neighborhood. So to ensure this momentum, the charter should set additional standards for a citywide process and timeline for community board appointments. And lastly, I just want to say—
This one is lastly.
Yes. Well, I was only going to come today, Mr. Chair, if I could give you my stem winder, because if you're going to tinker on the edges, don't tinker at all. You need to have, in my view, with all due respect, a comprehensive look at community boards, or we're going to get into the narrow discussion of term limits, not term limits, and not address 5 borough community board reform. So I will stop there because I see you're a little chagrined, but thank you.
I am not chagrined, and I do appreciate your very thoughtful presentation.
Thank you.
And we're looking forward to getting your written proposal.
Thank you.
I have, again, I'm going to cheat my fellow members and ask the first question. Sort of a two-point question. There's 2 things you said intrigued me. One had to do with those $800 or $1,000 an hour lawyers. And then your solution, seems to me, is to hire a recent graduate from a architectural school or something. And do you think that will even out the process?
You know, so the point I was making is when I became borough president, we realized that most community board members, even with board members who had specific land use experience, could not begin to compete with the resources that a developer would have at their disposal. They obviously had the best lawyers in town. They were proposing to build $100 million developments. Think about just in Manhattan alone at that point. You had Columbia University, Fordham University, NYU. Their budget for engaging the community was unlimited.
I understand that.
What we were able to do was create a urban planning fellowship that began this process of getting expertise, people who actually were graduate students in urban planning, into these community boards so that we could at least give them some ray of expertise on an ongoing basis. What that experience proved to me was that, yes, we cannot rely on graduate students to stem that tide, So why not hire or mandate that every community board should have a professional urban planner working full-time on land use issues?
I was being the devil's advocate. I mean, obviously, I agree with the idea of greater resources. It's just that I'm trying to come up with a vehicle that is even stronger than a one person attached to the office. And that was the reason I was poking fun at the $800 an hour attorney. The other question I get, you didn't answer, is term limits. I think you're term limited. Lots of people are term limited and develop expertise in their particular job. Why would you be for term limits for community board members?
So I respect certainly the will of the voters who have now spoken at the ballot box that there should be term limits for citywide elected officials. And I would never seek to change that, nor will you. But you could. Well, if Dr. Clark says that could happen. But here's what I do think we should recognize, that whether it's when you have term limits, you also have a lame duck status that sets in. We're going to see that with people who are now in their 5th year wondering what office they're going to run for next. And I dare say you're going to see a lot of musical chairs and people thinking about the future, not necessarily the job in front of them. And that's just the reality of elected term limits. I think one of the things our process showed was when you have an independent screening panel that looks at attendance, evaluates people based on merit, and creates a system where the appointive process is not automatic, the data I'm submitting to you shows that over 8 years, we put on the board 715 new people. We upped the diversity of the Manhattan Community Boards by 40%. So by going to a non-political merit-based process, it wasn't about term limits. We had the benefit of keeping the long-term community board member who does a great job, right? And at the same time, and that individual should stay, but we also put new blood on the community boards, people with fresh perspective and different points of view. I will say to you that during our community board process, there was one community board member that had been very cruel to my mother when she ran for city council back in the 1970s. And the same individual was equally unpleasant when I ran for borough president. I'm the first to admit that during my campaign for borough president, when it was 95-degree weather outside, I did think about the first thing I would do would throw him off the committee board. I have to admit this. I know this is something you shouldn't say at a hearing. And then when we engaged community board reform, I did say, hey, remember that guy? He probably doesn't have good attendance. Check it out. Came back and said, wow, this guy has never missed a meeting in 20 years. Well, what did his evaluation do? Came back to me and said, he's perfect. He's the perfect board member. I said, he's never missed a meeting in 20 years. He does all of this. Who does that on a community board? And I reappointed him. And once we reappointed him, we basically said the politics of community boards, we're done with that. We're going to create a merit-based system. You have the opportunity of creating a system that will elevate the borough presidents and the new ones by 2021, and you will make community boards something that's even more attractive to people who want to access potential public service.
Kyle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Controller, for being here. You've been an innovator throughout your political career on how constituents access and participate in government. I want to thank you for that. There's a couple of things that I want to ask, and I want to make sure it comes out as clear as I speak as it does in my head. Ms. Chung actually had made a statement that the land use chair is one of the most coveted positions in the community boards. But as you had mentioned, there are 59 community boards throughout this city, and new development is not particularly equal throughout those community boards. And I think over the last 20 years, there's been a huge increase in development in the city and overwhelmingly in a few communities throughout this city. So there are other issues that are very important to community boards that are not going through land use or ULURP process on a regular and overwhelming basis. And so you had suggested that each community board be given an expert on those issues, and I'm not sure. And through your experience, I'd ask if you think that each board actually needs one. And I know, you know, the geographies change and interests in our communities change. But I think currently the vast majority of these community boards are not experiencing kind of overwhelming applications for ULURPs as happens in Manhattan and Rivers, you know, the parts of Queens and Brooklyn that is currently taking place. And so I'm interested in knowing whether or not you think that each community board actually needs an expert or needs access to someone who is an expert. And then I'd say that, well, let me pose that to you.
That's a very fair question, and I don't mean to suggest that every neighborhood is facing the same particular issues, although I do think that gentrification now knows no bounds. Mm-hmm. And I think what's happening in many communities is that there are changing skylines and there are unique problems that we have to face both globally as a city and also locally. So let's think about what an urban planner with some great expertise could do to assist the community board. It's not just reviewing a ULURP application. There is a whole issue now that we see throughout the city on closing storefronts and vacant property. And doing analysis to figure out why that is happening in our unique neighborhoods, I think is something that we should do. There are bike lanes and transportation issues in every community. We need an urban planner who could lead on some studies unique to that community. We also need people who have that kind of background to sort of think about what would a community 197A plan be? What would the community like to see in terms of development? There's a whole issue that we struggle with every day, the huge undertaking by this administration on an affordable housing plan and how you grapple with sort of what would we do to upzone on one block but downzone in another block, give us what that would look like, not just from the City Planning Commission's perspective, but what is the community's perspective? And then work to try to align whether the community and city government can find common ground. So I think there's a huge potential here, but the real potential is, well, the real discussion should be, what do you think the community boards are about in 2018? I would argue that the community board is less about being a service delivery operation, only because we have so many elected officials, 311, filling potholes, thinking about policing. We've built a whole mechanism around that. What is missing is why Wagner created community boards in 1951. We called them community planning boards for a reason, because we wanted to give people in communities a say in what their neighborhoods would look like. And I think that's more relevant today than it was 60 years ago. How we get to that change, I think, is unique. I testified at a Charter Vision Commission back in 2010. My testimony was longer back then. Sorry. Yeah. Carla was waiting to testify after me. But one of the things that they talked about as well, is this a proposal that's unique to what your office did, and maybe what you were doing in Manhattan is just not what the entire city would want? And I thought that was a fair question. And I think for you, the question is, what should a community board be about in the next 10 years, let's say? And I do think it's about land use and zoning, and it's about doing the critical analysis for community board members who really want to have more bandwidth to look at the unique issues in their neighborhoods.
I just want more follow-up. So this, I think, is related to term limits and turnover of leadership. especially considering that there's going to be a lot more development, a lot more ULURP going on. And I'm concerned too that our city government is based on checks and balances. We have in some community boards folks who have served as chair of land use, and I'm not casting aspersions against anyone, but it appears to me that it lacks a checks and balance that allows people to be maybe a little too cozy with developers who come before them over and over again successively, right? And so I lean toward, the question of, how do we create checks and balances to ensure that the process is both a fair and representative of the people that they're serving. And then in regards also to the turnover, my particular community board 13 in Queens, has had the highest number of marijuana stops and arrests in the city. And we're a very diverse community board, but it appears that only half of that community board is the one that's responsible for those numbers. And so, it's only recently that we've had new blood on the community board that this has been brought up as an issue and challenging the local commander about his practices. And so it's because of the turnover and the new blood on the community board that challenged, our local commander and politicians on this issue. And so to me, it kind of says something about whether or not, people have been on the little too long. And I'm not advocating for any particular term limit, but I think at some point in time, there needs to be opportunity for rotation of both thoughts and concepts on how the community board is engaged.
So we set up an independent screening panel. We had in-office interviews with longtime members of the community board. We looked at attendance records at board meetings, but also looked at committee representation. We had a screening panel of experts independent of my office who did that kind of recruitment. And then we created a list of the most qualified people based on their different experiences. And then we sat down with the committee board chair and other stakeholders and said, so for example, what do you need in your committee board? What are we missing? Well, we don't have architects on the committee board. We don't have that expertise, but there's a new member who is now working in an architecture firm. So why don't we go recruit her? We're missing, we don't have enough attorneys to look at some of litigation issues at the community board or best practices. So here's a guy who seems ready to serve. Let's go get that person. And then we had longtime members who didn't come out of the screening panel. People who were well-connected. I'm not saying that they're not qualified or good people, but they just, in comparison to what the board needed or what they could provide, the screening panel gave us the opportunity to only focus on the people we believe were the best based on merit. It doesn't mean, yes, it's hard when people who are connected or politically active don't make the community board. And sure, that certainly could hurt politically, but hey, at the end of the day, you have a screening panel. And that model was basically, I based it on a judicial screening panel. People select judges. If you want to be a judge in this town, for most of the city, you got to come out of a screening panel. There's nothing we can do for you unless you are found most qualified. And that was the model we used. So what's the proof? 715 new appointments in 8 years. That's a complete turnover of community boards without term limits. And if you really, and then you look at, well, what happened there? 40% in Manhattan, 40% of the people we appointed were people of color. 40%, and equally important, we integrated the community boards, right? So why should LGBT be focused in the village? Think about how silly that is. We tried to create that integration throughout. We now have Caucasian people on Community Board 10, but we also have African-American, Latino people in some of the whitest areas of Manhattan, the upper East Side and the Upper West Side. And you know what? the entire community is served better because we got people to believe that there was buy-in and reform and a different approach. Also, I think in your study of this, and I know we will continue to talk about offices, I do think that we have really some great borough presidents. I've served with some amazing borough presidents. And I think the more we can create a citywide holistic view of community board empowerment, I think that also enhances the role of borough presidents, city council members, and the community as well.
I'm going to have two commission members with brief questions. Dr. Clark, Carlo, am I right? Unless, no, I think that will be it, okay? Dr. Clark.
My question concerns the uniformity of the city in terms of the boroughs and the values of each borough president and the politics of each borough president towards their constituents and who may serve or who may not serve. And then the role of the council member who may tokenly be asked to name somebody that somebody else wants on the community planning board. How do we get around all of those issues to make it what you're talking about? And I'm also, because I'm an immigrant, I just want to put it out there that for the immigrant communities, there's always somebody who says, well, you don't have to do that much over there because they're not aware of what is happening in the community. How do we put a level playing field so all communities feel empowered and feel that they can participate?
So one of the crucial components of what we did over 8 years, Dr. Clark, was recognize that our goal was to diversify our community boards. And it wasn't always easy to go into communities and find people because usually the people who were most active were people who knew the system. And I can further break it down as you make your decisions on where we were successful in creating diversity. 40% over 8 years is a pretty good record, but we worked at it because diversity is something you have to work at every day. That was a key component of the committee board process. The other thing, and again, I would ask you to wrestle with this, is, as borough president, council members recommend half of the committee board appointments. Under the charter, I believe, Mr. Chair, it's a recommendation that the borough president could either take or not. And for the most part, my work with the council member was you appoint your half, I'll appoint my half, but we all have to agree that the people who we appoint will come out of the independent screening panel. So I said to them, we should only appoint on our list. And I have to tell you, in the beginning, there were council members who also had their view of community board reform and what they wanted to do. And so I recollected in year 1 and 2, it was a very bumpy journey. But I will tell you, at the end of the day, we would sit and decide the committee board appointments, and every council member in Manhattan, from Washington Heights to the Lower East Side, would sit with our screening panel recommendations and would look with me and say, yes, I need another architect. Yes, we need a public school teacher. Wait a minute, you mean that person hasn't shown up to committee meetings all year? No. We were able to focus on the merit of the need of the neighborhood and not the parochial view of who should be on the committee board. It wasn't always perfect. And by the way, there were people who I personally wanted to see on the committee board. I'm human too, right? And if they didn't make the list, they weren't going to be on the committee board. And we held to that in every single case.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Always good to see you. So I have two quick questions. First of all, I think this is obviously very well thought out. It's something that when I worked for the Brooklyn Borough president, boy, did I try, but we weren't ready back then, and maybe the time has come. But I have two questions about the independent, quote, screening panel, and perhaps I missed this. Who appoints that? And in your way of doing it. And then the second question is, what if the independent screening panel appointed the community board members. And there was no councilman or council person, and there was no borough president. And it was a true independent process. I'm curious to get your thoughts on it.
I mean, that's very well, but that's almost like a logical extension to be considered. I do think at the end of the day, the elected official should play a role, because that elected official does have a pulse of the community. And sometimes, well, there's no one who thinks reform and community board reform, no one thinks community board reform is more important than I do. I really believe in it. But I felt that the borough president and the council member should continue to have that role. That if you left it only to an independent screening panel, it could run away with the practicality of, you know what, you're the elected official, you're responsible, we hold you accountable. And if you create a system that there's no electoral accountability, you could have something that creates a whole new bureaucracy, and you are at the end of the day the only one accountable. You know, you don't run for community board, right? So you don't have to glad handle, you don't have to run for office. That is all true. But elected officials have to be out in the community. And if that panel is really not meeting the needs of the community, then electorally, you're going to have to explain that at community board meetings and be held accountable from your constituents.
And who appoints?
The borough president.
So you appointed the screening.
I want to thank you, Mr. Controller, for taking the time and for providing your testimony. It's been very, very helpful.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you.
With that, I'm going to move on to Rachel Bloom of the Citizens Union.
Hi, I will try and be brief, definitely within my 5 minutes. Good afternoon, Chair Perales and distinguished members of the New York City Charter Revision Commission. It's nice to see you again today. I am the Director of Public Policy and Programs at Citizens Union, and I thank you for inviting us here today and giving us the opportunity to publicly share our recommendations with you. Together, our positions on community board reform seek to strengthen community boards, providing them with additional resources while also ensuring that there is a more rigorous selection process and open process for appointment of members. Most of what we will say is things that you have heard earlier, but sometimes with a little bit of a different perspective. We believe that a mechanism should be created that provides an available pool of urban planners independent of the borough president's offices that can be accessed by community boards. We've now heard why this is critical to provide meaningful and informed input on land use decisions and to develop 197A plans. We envision these urban planners to be connected to one or more boards as needed, thereby establishing relationships with those boards and the larger communities they serve. While housing urban planners with a borough president is aligned with their current responsibilities to establish and maintain a planning office for the use development or improvement of land located in the borough under Section 82 of Chapter 4 of the City Charter, it could become problematic when the borough president may disagree with a community board on a land development issue, which we have all seen happen. Given their distinct roles in ULURP and past instances in which borough presidents have sought to remove community board members who have not aligned their votes to the sentiments of the borough president on land use proposals, it is essential that the independence of the community boards and the urban planners that serve them be maintained. We recommend reforming the process for selecting members to community boards. Community boards are often plagued by vacancies or not any turnover. To professionalize and open the boards to the communities they serve, we believe, much like we just heard in great detail, excuse me, a formal, standardized, and transparent process should be created for filling community board positions, as was first done by Comptroller Stringer when he was Manhattan Borough President. While there have been some more formalized procedures for filling vacancies among the borough presidents, they vary enormously from borough to borough. And if you all of them have their applications on their website to apply to be on the borough, to be on their community boards in their borough, and it's worth taking a look because some are 1 page and some are 7 pages, and the questions they ask really run the gamut, and there's no consistency from one borough to the other. We recommend that one formal appointment process is used throughout the city. Language should be added to the city charter that requires written applications and interviews of all appointees or reappointees by the borough president. It establishes a reasonable deadline for filling vacant positions and requires borough presidents to issue an annual report detailing their outreach efforts, whom they notified of the process, methods used, and the demographics of those serving on community boards in comparison to the communities that they serve. We also recommend that community boards receive an independent budget allocation that is not at the discretion of the mayor or council. We believe that they are currently insufficiently funded, and greater resources are essential for community boards to carry out their charter mandated responsibilities. To this end, community boards should be provided enough funding to be able to hire staff with land use and or budgetary expertise. And we recommend that the budget for community boards to be linked to that of the borough president's office, which we also believe should have independent budgeting, but I realize that it's not something that you are looking at as part of this Charter Revision Commission. And finally, we recommend that community boards have term limits serving 5 consecutive 2-year terms. This limit on terms should be phased in prospectively to ensure there is not a mass exodus of institutional knowledge, as we have heard some of the community board members discuss today. This will ensure that representation on boards can keep pace with the changing demographics of communities and does not become inaccessible to the communities that they serve. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. I'm particularly pleased that you were so clear and direct as to your recommendations. But we are drawing late. I'm going to move to Tam Amgadi as quickly as possible. Your prior presenter took a little bit more time than he was supposed to.
I was happy to give my time to the controller.
Tom?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I will also try to be as brief as possible, since I can double down on the next panel, which I sit on as well. My background is, aside from being a retired professor of urban planning from Hunter College, and prior to that, Pratt Institute, yes, in CUNY. I worked for 8 years in city government as a senior planner. So I see some things from the inside, continue to see them from the inside. And I do agree with Scott Stringer that we don't need to tinker around the edges anymore. It's time to do a fundamental revision of the charter to empower community boards. They were created almost 50 years ago, and there's been no fundamental revision of the role of community boards since then. And so much has changed in New York City. But one thing that hasn't changed is communities don't have a strong voice in planning for their futures. And that's universal. That's all 59 community districts. There's not one where people don't care about what their community is going to look like. Gentrification and displacement are occurring all over the city. Every community cares about who's going to get to stay and who's not going to be able to afford to stay. So community boards are really key. The one thing, sort of basically, since I've studied the history of this, and you're free to check out my best-selling books, New York for Sale, and a recent book about zoning. This community boards were created as the result of the civil rights movement. In the 1960s, there was a demand for community control. And it came out of the neighborhoods that were mostly underserved and with people with low incomes, mostly Black and Latino neighborhoods. It was a step ahead, but right from the start, it started with so many limitations placed on it that it couldn't really truly serve. And there was one revision since 1975, 1989, which was also the result of the civil rights movement, when the city was taken to court and forced to get rid of the Board of Estimate because it failed the constitutional rule of one person, one vote. And at that time, the revisions there was testimony for a revision by the civil rights movement and great support from environmental justice advocates who were fighting to control unwanted land uses in their neighborhoods, in their backyards. But there's one philosophy that has continued all through this almost 50 years, that community boards are dysfunctional. And I hear this all the time from within city government. Oh, you want to give community boards more power? You want to give them money? It comes from within city government and it comes from developers. It is actually a good to have dysfunctional community boards because you can then keep them dysfunctional. Now, we've grown an awful lot and community boards have become much more proficient on their own. But what has resulted is the kind of inequalities across the board. I've been in 5 boroughs. I've been in many community boards all over the 5 boroughs, and some have excellent track records and have boards who are fully participate in the decisions that are made and are capable of confronting serious land use issues. But there are many who are helpless. And it coincides with those neighborhoods where people are working 2 or 3 jobs. They can't go to community board meetings. It coincides with the fact that the most functional community boards have an excess of lawyers and architects who can volunteer to sit on community boards and provide that expertise that many other community boards just don't have. So this requires a citywide solution and a major responsibility on behalf of the city as a whole to make sure that the original purpose of community boards.
Tom, let me ask you something. Can I interrupt you? Do you have some specific recommendations as to how we would accomplish what you're asking?
Yes. So one of the first things is stop saying that community board votes are only advisory. That's a good way to put them down. Community boards have to revise the Euler process so that the community board vote is equal to the vote of the mayor. Full-time planners, by the way, it's already in the charter. It was passed in 1989. But the council to the city planning department made a ruling that they would fulfill their charter obligation by assigning a city planning department planner to community boards who needed it. That is not the intention of the charter revision. Every community board needs to have a full-time planner on their staff, and that can be changed without changing the charter. Or you can clarify it in the charter. No more conditional votes by community boards. Because one of the ways you express your weakness is to say, our vote is only advisory, we can't do anything. So we're gonna vote yes, or we're gonna vote no, but with conditions. And then they have no weight. So that's it. I think finance, budget, also the budget process. Community boards participate in a budget process which is inadequate. There's one borough-wide budget hearing every year and a number of other local budget hearings. But every community board should have participatory budgeting, but for a significant portion of the budget that affects those communities.
Great. Any questions from commissioners? Okay, thank you very, very much. We appreciate you sitting here through this panel, and look forward to hearing more information in the coming weeks. Should we go right into the next panel? Okay. I'm stealing his notes. Okay. So our next panel will be on land use in New York City. And I'm going to introduce David Karnofsky, who's a partner at Fried Frank. David, thank you. And Mr. Karnofsky is going to give us a short overview on land use in New York City, just so we have context. Jessica Katz, Executive Director, Citizens Housing Planning Council. Tom, you're not going too far. Moses Gates, Vice President, Housing and Neighborhood Planning for the Regional Plan Association. Ron Schiffman, Professor Emeritus, Pratt Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment. Elena Conti, again, Director of Policy, Pratt Center for Community Development. And last but not least, Adrian Weibgen. Did I say that right?
No.
Tell me how to say it.
Weibgen.
Staff Attorney, Equitable Neighborhoods Practice, Community Development Project, Urban Justice Center. I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director now. And we are going to ask if you can really hit your points. I know many of you have given us testimony in writing, but given the time nature of this afternoon, if you can give us your points, and then we'll follow up either with some questions today or in the coming week or two. So, Matt, would you like to take it from here?
Thanks very much, Mr. Secretary. We don't have additional substantive comments except to reinforce our format, which is the five-minute presentations by our panelists. I'll give you the 1 minute heads up. Thanks so much. And then for the commissioners, we'll ask clarifying questions for each panelist, and then try to hold broader questions for the end of the panel if we can.
I'm back. Let's begin in the order I've been given. We'll start with David Karnofsky.
Good afternoon. I'm David Karnofsky from the firm of Fried Frank. I'm not here representing the firm. I'm here to, as an individual. I served as the general counsel to the Department of City Planning for 15 years before joining the law firm. I was asked to provide an overview of the land use in New York City in 10 minutes, which is impossible. 5 minutes is truly impossible, so I'll see what I can do. I thought that rather than focus on land use in general, it's useful to think about what the role of the city charter is in land use specifically. Obviously, the charter establishes all the various agencies that are players in the process, and I don't have to list them, you know them, but most importantly, perhaps, at least I think, it establishes procedures by which decisions are made, principally in the form of the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, ULURP. The charter identifies players in the process. It establishes the procedures that are followed, but significantly, it doesn't express a point of view, a perspective about what those policies and decisions should consist of. So to illustrate, obviously, while the charter creates a process for the review of zoning determinations, it doesn't address the content of the zoning resolution, that vast document that people have compared unfavorably to the Internal Revenue Code at all. It doesn't address topics like waterfront zoning or transfer of development rights or inclusionary housing or gentrification. That is not its function. Rather, its importance is to establish the legal, procedural, and decision-making framework within which decisions are made by communities, planners, and elected officials. And the principal way in which it does so, of course, is ULURP. So on to ULURP. I think it's important to understand ULURP in the context of what led to its creation in 1975 by a state-appointed Charter Revision Commission, that it was appointed at a time when the city was in fiscal crisis and the state was exercising heightened scrutiny of the city. And it was also against the backdrop, I think, of an increased call for community control and community involvement, as well as the end of the infamous Robert Moses era of planning. What the commission at that time identified was a series of issues. First, it identified the problem of insufficient community participation in the process, and at that time, the involvement of the community boards was really ad hoc. They were involved in some actions and not in others, and it was kind of an irregular system. Secondly, fragmentation and lack of accountability. The commission observed that there were too many procedures and too many different kinds of actions, and that undermined public confidence. And third was delay. They observed that there was a lot of delay in the process with no way of resolving conflicts, and that they festered for a long time. So in thinking about how to create a system, they had to address a bunch of issues. First of all, how to balance local, borough-wide, and citywide interests in the process. And there's a really interesting quote from that report. It says, "The dilemma for the Charter Commission is how to give local communities a say in shaping important land use policies without granting them veto power over the public welfare. In other words, how to strengthen, not balkanize, the city's neighborhoods and communities." What they concluded was that there is actually no way to distinguish between purely local issues and purely citywide issues, that all issues have elements that are local and elements that are citywide, and that there wasn't a category of action where the local voice should have a veto power. So it decided that the best way to deal with this was to give the community boards first action on all land use issues that affect their areas, allowing them to shape the proposals in the early stages and influence the decisions made at a later stage by the City Planning Commission and at that time the Board of Estimate. In terms of predictability and consistency, they decided to establish a uniform process. This is where we get the word uniform out of ULURP, a single process for all major land use actions, under which a zoning change would go through the same process as, let's say, a disposition of city property. And in terms of delay, they prescribed a time clock for action by each of the parties, from the community board to the borough president, the planning commission to the Board of Estimate, with no ability of any party to stop the clock. And they also looked very carefully at the balance between the professional role and the political role, recognizing that the planning commission as the planning body had an important role, but that the last stop should be the Board of Estimate as the political body. So the end result of all of this was a system that provides for a graduated sequence of public review under mandated time periods that moves from the most local level to the regional level to the citywide level. The underlying thesis of all of this was that a land use application, as it moves through the process, is shaped in ways that produce a better decision, that the local input at the early stages influences the other decision makers, that the project changes in response to comment, and that the decision makers modify the project as it moves along, all within this prescribed time clock. Moving along to 1988, you have the abolition of the Board of Estimate and a whole lot of decisions that had to be made about how to deal with that in terms of ULURP. The first big question, of course, was what's the role of the City Council? The Charter Commission at that time, and I had the pleasure to attend all of their meetings as a young lawyer, had to decide what jurisdiction they should have. Should it be the same as the Board of Estimate? And the big question was, are there some actions that shouldn't even go to the City Council? The legislative actions like zoning, of course, they are legislative in nature, but there are many administrative actions in land use, and they wrestled with it. But they concluded that just in the case of this distinction between local and citywide, that there really wasn't a clear distinction between purely legislative and administrative. You have administrative actions which in a local community are so important and have so much potential impact that they decided that everything should be capable of going to the City Council. And they created a process around that by which some items are automatically going to the council, while others are within elective jurisdiction. The council has to decide to review them. And that was their solution to that dilemma. They had to worry about the borough presidents because the borough presidents who were on the Board of Estimate had a lot of power, and now they were disempowered. The council was empowered, and they created a review role for the borough presidents, which is advisory, but the theory was that the borough presidents would use their bully pulpits to achieve change in these projects. And the prior speaker, the controller, was one of those borough presidents who surely did that in many cases. Then there was a big question about what should be the composition of the Planning Commission. The commission, up until that time, was purely mayoral. And the question was, should they try to recreate the Board of Estimate within the commission by giving the borough presidents a role there as well as the public advocate? Ultimately, they came down in favor of a balance of power between the mayor and the council, where the Planning Commission is dominated by mayoral appointees with some appointments by the borough presidents as well. So that's the system we have today. ULURP applies to 12 categories of actions, and I can't go through them all, but just to highlight some important ones and some distinctions. With respect to zoning, changes in zoning maps, it's in simple terms a change from a manufacturing district to a residential district, let's say. Those all go through ULURP. And there are two types of applications, generally speaking. One, applications made by private parties for their property, and secondly, applications made by public parties, principally the Department of City Planning, for larger areas. Then you have categories of actions that are predominantly applied for by private parties, developers, owners, like special permits, where someone's trying to modify the regulations that apply to a particular building that they'd like to build, whether it's the height and setback, the use. Those are predominantly private applications. And then you have applications which are by nature city-driven, like site selections. Those are applications made by city agencies. In the case of site selection, it's about the establishment of a new city facility, whether it be a new sanitation garage or a new wastewater treatment plant. Those are obviously applications for capital projects made by city agencies. And so ULURP is kind of a melange of those different types of applications. I think you understand, and I'm not going to go in detail through how the process works and how it marches through the sequence, but basically you understand that there's 60 days at the board, 30 days at the borough presidents, 60 days at the planning commission, and 50 to 65 days at the city council. One of the questions, of course, is, well, where is the mayor in all of this? What happened to the mayor? And the answer is that the mayor has a veto power over the council's action, and the council can override the mayor's veto, like in the case of local legislation. But the mayor's veto is not a line item veto, and so it's rarely used. What do I mean? Let's assume city planning proposes a big rezoning like East Midtown. The city planning commission approves it, the city council approves it, but it adds modifications that the mayor doesn't like. If the mayor vetoes, he's vetoing the entire project. He can't single out the modifications. That's the way it works, and as a result, the veto is extremely rare. And as a practical matter, the council is the last say. So in conclusion, this is a very intricate process. It's guided by a set of objectives that were identified in 1975, that were reinforced by changes made by the Fritz Schwartz Commission in the 80s, and that continue in place today. And those objectives and goals remain as important today as they were back then. No process is perfect, and ULURP is by no means perfect, and no process guarantees a particular result either. But I think overall that it has stood the test of time. I would suggest that major changes and adjustments to ULURP should not be made without a huge amount of study, a very significant investigation, so that we can ensure that some of the values that were embedded in it in 1970 system. Thank you.
Thank you. That's been very, very instructive for those of us on the commission who are not planners. I'm going to ask that you all go through your presentation. We took too long in the last panel. So it's 5 minutes for each, and then the commission can get at you. Is that fair? With that, Jessica Katz.
Hi, how are you? Thank you. I want to thank the members of the Charter Reform Commission for this important discussion and for asking me to speak here today. My name is Jessica Katz. I'm the Executive Director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, CHPC. Founded in 1937, CHPC's mission as a civic organization is to develop and advance practical public policies to support the housing stock of the City of New York. We are a council of 90 leading professionals across all aspects of the housing and planning sectors. Prior to joining CHPC this year, I spent 12 years at the New York City Department of Housing and Urban Development, Preservation and Development, where I held various positions, but for most of my time in city government, I was responsible for the city's supportive housing pipeline to create homes for chronically homeless and disabled New Yorkers throughout New York City's neighborhoods. I'm very proud of the community engagement strategies that we have built in the supportive housing sector and believe that it is only by engaging in a robust community process that we have been able to create so many successful supportive housing projects throughout New York City. I'm here today in my capacity as Executive Director of CHPC, eager to engage in a discussion about how to improve the quality of our public discourse and ensure a better decision-making process to guide land use decisions in our complicated, ever-changing city. And on a personal note, as a policy nerd, I'm very envious of your role as members of this commission. You have the opportunity to reform the circulatory system and the skeleton of the New York City government, and I hope you're all enjoying the process, even as busy as it must be. CHPC has been working over recent years to change the city's approach to land use issues. We want to make it easier for community members to say yes to local land use actions that they support and not simply easier to say no. That means having a more streamlined review process that incorporates community feedback, environmental reviews, and input from government agencies in a way that is collaborative instead of adversarial. Rather than simply putting more potential roadblocks in the hands of those who would oppose any change, the city should make adjustments to its land use procedures to make a new housing a positive asset for communities and their existing residents. Community input is a core value of our democracy, but not all community processes are created alike. We must ensure that New York City's land use process can incorporate both local and citywide needs, can drive the creation of affordable housing rather than act as a deterrent. Community planning rather than NIMBYism should rule the day. City charter reform creates an opportunity to make meaningful change, but it also runs the risk of handing the keys to the city to those that resist the creation of much needed affordable housing or give too strong a voice to a vocal few, while those most in need are shut out of the process. In that spirit, I want to put forth 5 key recommendations. First, a predictable timeline is critical. The ULURP process currently has a well-defined timeline that is crucial. That should not change, and any discussion of lengthening that process must be balanced against the costs of doing so. Second, the process must find a way to balance citywide needs against neighborhood goals. Third, we need to start by establishing our goals for the land use process. Community input and participation is a value and a goal in itself, but New York City has many other planning and development goals: creation of affordable housing, returning city-owned land to productive use, and neighborhood revitalization, among others. Fourth, the Department of City Planning must have the resources so they can better process land use actions and provide more robust technical assistance to community boards. Fifth, we must create a process that gives voice to the voiceless. Currently, the only people who don't have a vote in the ULURP process are those who may someday live in the new housing proposed. For an example that is near and dear to my heart, there are 60,000 homeless people in New York City, and they do not, for the most part, attend community board meetings. And yet it's both our legal and moral responsibility to ensure that their needs are met. And to wrap up, I just want to say the ULURP process as it currently stands, it's long, it's technical, and it's messy. Communities complain their voices are not heard. Developers complain that their needs are not being met. The pre-ULURP process is used for productive negotiation and as a stall tactic. In the course of your public hearings, you will hear complaints that the process is too rigid and at once too open-ended, that there is too much community input as well as not enough. So where I started my testimony today with all the reasons why ULURP reform is needed, there will be no perfect solution that satisfies everyone. And it just may be that, like any good negotiation, we know we've succeeded when all parties walk away unhappy with the result. It may be that the ULURP process, for all its faults, is simply a reflection of how difficult these land use choices are and that the controversy is not a reflection of a broken process at all, but of a productive push and pull among stakeholders. Thank you again for inviting CHPC to be part of today's discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll have questions after we've heard from everybody. Tom, we're going to go to you next. He needs a microphone.
Oh, yeah.
I think one of the big problems is not the Euler process, the length of the Euler process itself. I'm not suggesting lengthening it or shortening it. It goes through necessary steps. The problem is pre-Euler. All of those discussions that go on, side discussions, agreements that get made in, behind closed doors, are part of the undemocratic process that precedes Euler. And it's followed by a series of public hearings at the community board level, at the borough president level, at the city planning commission level, at the city council level, which are more theater than true democracy. Why? Because we're stuck in a method for participation that is bankrupt. I've attended many of these and have heard people upset because they have to wait 8 hours, 10 hours to give a 3-minute presentation to a panel that's absent. There's only a stenographer and there's 1 or 2 people on the panel who happen to be there with their eyes open. This is broken. We need true democratic participation and dialogue between the people who are going to make those decisions. And perhaps we need to have public advocates, or perhaps the public advocate's office, get involved in structuring a truly democratic process. The other thing that's broken is the environmental review process. It occurs mostly before a ULURP application is certified and goes through ULURP. It's done in a very highly technical language that most people don't understand, including many elected officials who have to take the vote. And in the meantime, the environment suffers because the real environmental issues that need to be addressed when you have massive development go through a process of environmental review that is only geared towards disclosing potential negative impacts and not necessarily mitigating them, and not necessarily changing the way the city does business so that future land use actions don't have negative environmental impacts. Environmental review is a disclosure process. It does not require anybody to do anything. And there's no follow-up, even when there's a promise of a mitigation, there's no follow-up 10 years down the line to see if that school was built. So there have been several proposals for changing this pre-ULURP process. Community benefit agreements, memorandums of understanding written coming out of the mayor's office or other offices in city government, but they disappear very quickly. The Williamsburg rezoning in 2005 was followed by a memorandum of understanding of about 30 pages coming from the mayor's office that nobody can seem to find today. There's nothing in it that requires the city absolutely to provide the financing and services that were promised in that memorandum of understanding.
1 minute remaining.
Yeah. So my recommendations are basically sunshine for the pre-ULURP process. Make it out in the open, public, and don't let it be negotiating behind closed doors, because then people get to the ULURP process and they say, all the deals have been made. We can't change anything. The applicants are reluctant to make any significant changes because it might set them back, and they might have to do another environmental review and start all over again. Change participation and make it truly democratic and participatory, and engage so that people can engage with the issues at hand. Community boards, again, need the financing to be able to have the professional help and also to be able to provide information to the citizens and the people who participate in the ULURP process. I do think community boards need to be elected and more representative. And again, that's very uneven. There are many community boards, particularly with new immigrant communities, that are multilingual and conduct all their business in one language, English. Training paid for by the city of community board members in the areas that they are engaged with. And I do think the community boards are old and mature enough now that their votes can be equal to the mayor's votes. Not in my backyard. Exclusionary thinking is not only a neighbor, it doesn't reside only in neighborhoods. It resides in government as well. It takes a different form. So let's attack NIMBYism wherever it may occur. And let communities have a real stake in the ULURP process. Just in the last year, I've attended many community board hearings, land use committee hearings, where hundreds of people, these are rezonings that are very unpopular, hundreds of people turn out to demonstrate and loudly and disrupt and close down the meetings because they don't feel that's a symptom of a lack of power. It's not power. And finally, one other detail I think that should be reconsidered are the fair share requirements that were in the 1989 charter revision and are extremely weak. This is that every community should get no more than its fair share of burdensome land uses like waste transfer stations.
Your time is up. We'll get a chance to ask you some follow-up questions, Tom. Thank you very, very much. The next name on my list is Moses Gates.
Thank you, and I do apologize. I have a 4 o'clock meeting downtown and are going to have to go after this. My name is Moses Gates. I'm the Vice President for Housing and Community Planning at Regional Plan Association. And we work not just in New York City, but in the kind of tri-state area, half of Connecticut, Hudson Valley, Long Island, Northern New Jersey. And the first thing I kind of want to acknowledge is that compared to many other municipalities, ULURP is both more transparent, more community involved, and more predictable for the developers than many, many other land use processes in the region. I think that we need to start by kind of acknowledging the parts that are good as well as the parts that need improving. In our experience, the symptom of kind of the conflict, the neighborhood-city conflict throughout much of the ULURP process that can both stop good things from happening and also not give communities power over unneeded or unwanted uses is a sense that there is no ability to proactively community plan. That unless you're able to put forth a positive vision that has some oomph behind it and some ability to be recognized, that the only option you're left with is an option of obstruction or an option of essentially trying to go through the process and make the best of what might be perceived as a bad deal. And I think the Charter Commission has a real interesting opportunity to kind of revisit that and make things a lot more predictable for the development community as well as a lot better for kind of the communities that are going through this. I would say that the biggest thing in terms of community board reform, and we've kind of discussed that, there are many, many tools and processes. One I want to point out is a civic engagement tool that was actually developed by the government of Madrid called Console, which is kind of an open source software tool When I was a tour guide and routinely worked until 11 o'clock at night, I was not able to attend any community board meetings. And I actually really wanted to at that point in life. If you work nights, if you can't get childcare, if you, are otherwise kind of have life obstacles, you are to a large extent kind of shut out of the community process, even though we've advanced to the point where there are other tools other than going to a weekly evening meeting every alternate Tuesday to kind of give our influence and have communities give thoughts as to the land use process, and we're long overdue to embrace those. The other thing we can do is enable communities to kind of proactively plan for their neighborhoods, which is, again, starting to happen a little bit in a very interesting way. The ULURP process is essentially a disclosure process, and decision-making is more or less a tripartite negotiation process between the relevant city council person, the administration, and whoever is proposing the project. And if you are proposing the project, you kind of have a seat at the table. And what communities are starting to learn is that if they propose the project, it might not come out the other side as they are envisioning, but they're able to drive a discussion and able to have a seat at the table, because in the ULURP process, anyone is able to propose a rezoning. If it is legal and it meets all the requirements, you're able to put it in, and legally, city planning needs to move forward with it. What is happening and what we're seeing is that communities are doing this, but only communities that have the financial resources and social capital to be able to do it. For instance, the rezoning process on the Upper East Side, that was done essentially to try to knock some height off of a proposed tower. That was able to be done because of the finances and the social capital of the community on the Upper East Side, and that is part of our process.
1 minute remaining.
An Office of Community-Based Planning that would be able to both give resources and assist communities in developing kind of a proactive framework would be very interesting. Not necessarily a rezoning framework, because I don't think that that addresses most community needs. But if communities were able to put forward a positive vision that included, and I must stress this, included fair share provisions, not just for infrastructure, but for housing development and affordable housing development, and that was part of what was worked out with the administration, you would be able to kind of create a blueprint that developers would be able to work within and have a lot more understanding and be able to kind of move through the process with a lot less resistance. If there is a little bit more definition of what the community is looking for, both in terms of development and also in terms of any kind of added amenities that might result from the development process. So we want to stress kind of the Office of Community-Based Planning that could kind of help facilitate this, as well as more modern tools for civic engagement, which will allow a much, much greater voice of people to be present in the development process, as opposed, and I must stress, more voices does not necessarily lead to a different outcome than less voices. I think that's fairly neutral in the outcomes that might happen. And thirdly, some form of fair share process, but a fair share process that also acknowledges that communities need to meet housing obligations and need to meet affordable housing obligations in kind of a growing and increasingly expensive city, as well as community amenities and infrastructure obligations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cates, and I hope you make your meeting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will give it my best shot.
Ron Schiffman. It's not, I can't, is that?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Commissioners and dear colleagues, I'm Ron Schiffman. I'm Director Emeritus of the Pratt Center for Community Development, which I founded in 1964. I also was chair of the Planning Department of Pratt for a number of years, and I'm Professor Emeritus there. And I served on the City Planning Commission between 1990 and 1996. I want to step back a little bit because I think a lot of the decisions you make have to be made within a framework. The year I graduated from high school and entered architectural school, bus segregation in the United States was being vigorously challenged and eventually ended. Until the Montgomery bus boycott, Americans accepted the fact that African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus and whites in the front. And when a white person entered the bus and there were no empty seats, a black person had to get up and yield their seat to a white person. Today, we acknowledge that outrage is wrong, except when it comes to land use and development decisions. Displacement of residents because of their class, race, or income, or nation of origin has become commonplace in every community in this city and in too many cities across the nation. This is in large part is because we allow our land use decisions to be guided by marketplace principles and the highest and best use principles. The Appraisal Institute defines highest and best use as follows: the reasonable, probable, and legal use of land or an improved property that is physically possible, appropriately supported, financially feasible, and that results in the highest value. We allow concepts like highest and best use when we engage in market and developer-driven land use zoning and development decisions, all of which dictates how land use decisions are made in the city. Highest values assessed purely in market terms and not based on a set of human scale determinants or a shared vision of our city as a city of social, economic, and cultural diversity, a city of inclusion and opportunity. We ignore the phrase and the definition legal use of, which can and should include factors such as social and economic integration and other values that can result from engaging in a planning process to achieve constitutionally guaranteed rights and collectively desired outcomes. Instead, we engage in land use decisions predicated on policies to attract the creative class, middle-income families, and to maximize the return on real estate speculation. When we do this, we are telling low, moderate, and often middle-income residents, new immigrants, and people of color that they are to yield their seats to those of higher income and to those that generate more wealth for a select few. 53 years after Montgomery, we use the same principle of racial segregation in a sophisticated way to sort out and segregate our society, not in buses, but in our neighborhoods. We are all victims of that policy. We all pay for the resulting disparities. This city needs to stop a land use policy driven by development and instead adopt a policy based on principles of inclusion and opportunity, coupled and driven by community-based planning. Planning must precede land use and zoning actions. Planning, if properly undertaken, would include social, economic, environmental, education, and transportation factors at the outset. It should be comprehensive and integrated, not separating our needs into silos, but weaving together a strategy that leads to qualitative and viable places. Planning needs to be people-centered, not driven by speculative or narrow economic concerns. Specifically, I'd like to refer you to the testimony of Paula Siegel, and maybe Adrian will also allude to that outlines some important steps that need to be taken and that should be an integral part of any proposed charter change. I would also suggest that you read and reread the report entitled The Inclusive City, Strategies to Achieve More Equitable and Predictable Land Use in New York City, and meet with members of that working group that produced that report. In large part, their recommendations are an outgrowth of the experience and the deliberation of 24 of New York City's civic organizations dedicated to the health, vitality, and qualitative growth and development of the city. Indeed, there are many communities in New York City, especially environmental justice communities, many of whom have been engaged with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance and engaged in their own inclusive, proactive, comprehensive planning for a long time with neither assistance nor support from the city. They are a blueprint for the type of planning called for an inclusive and just city. Today is Juneteenth, a day, Freedom Day, that commemorates the announcement in Texas of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation ending slavery throughout the former Confederacy, issued 2 years before that. Unfortunately, the legacy of slavery and the Jim Crow laws that followed have not all been eliminated. Indeed, many of them continue in a sophisticated way and are perpetrated by too many in our profession. in the way we develop our land use and zoning policies and in the development that they spawn. This commission has the opportunity, indeed the obligation, to craft a charter that sets a new direction. Please seize the opportunity to reject the land use policies of today and engage in a planning first policies that in turn lead to the land use and zoning policies necessary to create an equitable and sustainable city of opportunity, one based on principles of social, economic, and environmental justice. I think through that kind of framework, then the details fall into place. We have a city planning commission, like the community planning boards, that has no longer the word planning. They're a zoning commission. They're a land use review commission. They're not looking at planning. They're not looking at the totality of what we do in our city that comes to rest in the neighborhoods where our people live. And I think it's about time that we began to reinstitute the planning process. We stripped away from the Planning Commission years ago the right to review the capital budget. And with that, we also stripped away any creativity of that agency to go out and work with communities in a true and honest way, listening to community-initiated efforts to begin to see how the people can craft and develop their neighborhoods. Sure, we need a predictable timetable. Sure, we need more affordable housing. But our affordable housing strategies are such that they're creating greater displacement in the communities while it's bringing in more affordable housing for a different income group. The people on a local level are not stupid. They know what's happening when the area is changing. They know what's happening when their schools are overcrowded and they don't see a school in the pipeline. We've got to reinstitute a 197A planning process, which is a community-initiated planning process that has teeth, that really engages the community and the developers and others in predictable forms that can take place in their area. But unless we think about the words and the processes in the framework of justice, then we're going to be failing in this charter revision.
Thank you, Ron. We appreciate your comments. Elena?
Good afternoon, later in the afternoon. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak and listen. Again, I'm at the Pratt Center for Community Development. I am a spring chicken compared to Ron and Tom, but I have about 15 years of experience in this. And what I didn't say last time was that I particularly appreciate the openness of this commission to really interrogate these issues, even though it wasn't the part of the official formal charge. I think it's a really critical time in the city to be considering this. Things are at a fever pitch in terms of the development battles in the city and the consideration of what's happening on the neighborhood level. The overarching point that I want to make is that planning is more than land use, right? It properly considers the systems and the structures into which land use fits, right? It's about the social, environmental, and economic well-being, and land use is not planning, right? And so I think we are asking the wrong questions of our land use procedures, right? Both government stakeholders, developers, and communities feel as though too much is being lumped onto the process unfairly, right? Communities feel as though the structural issues that are related to employment and right to stay, access to quality education, environmental health and quality, all of these things are being ignored through the land use process, and that land use changes have impacts on those things that are not being addressed. And on the flip side, government agencies and private actors feel as though they're being asked to address questions that are outside of their jurisdiction or responsibility, that are outside the bounds of the land use process. And in government, they either question the connections that community members are making about cause and effect, or even if they are inclined to trust those connections, they are without the tools to incorporate them into their work. I'm sorry, this is kind of scratchy. Does that?
Just a little more distance.
More distance, thank you. Sorry, I'm not a professional testifier. And the response by communities often, looks like, okay, we need to oppose this in order to get less of what I don't want, right? And oftentimes council members, especially in lower income and communities of color, are saying, well, I need to embrace or invite this in order to get more of what we deserve in terms of structural investment. And all of that just puts too much on land use. Land use can't do all of that, right? But planning can do more of that. And this is where this really echoes Ron's comments, right? So again, I'm a spring chicken, but I still have co-authored something, in 2010 for the last Charter Revision Commission, and I referenced it. You've probably all seen it. It's very short. It says we need to plan comprehensively. It says we need to strengthen community-based planning. We need to address fair share, and we need to track commitments, right? All of those things are still true. There's been modest progress with the Neighborhood Commitment Bill 1102 about tracking specific commitments, but honestly, that's the smallest piece. The biggest piece, the structural cause, the root of it all, is that we're not planning comprehensively as a city, right? So we've got a bunch of different policies, right? Nitrogen Next Gen, 8550, One New York City, Turning the Tide, against homelessness, the capital planning process, the Neighborhood Development Fund, 100,000 good jobs, right? Lovely policies, or maybe policies that we can critique, or both, right? But they don't speak to each other, right? They're not cross-referenced, right? The relationship of that to the planning that's happening on the ground is unclear. I think a lot of time people brand communities as stupid in terms of thinking that the land use process can address all of these problems, right? Oh, they just don't understand that that's not how it works. I think folks very well do understand that all of the action, attention, political capital, and energy is being placed into the land use process, right? And there is a vacuum of energy around consistent policy making that treat the social, environmental, and economic needs of a community, and they are going, right, to where the action is in order to get needs met, because the system around it is deficient, the planning system, right?
1 minute, right?
Oh my, okay. So quickly, we need a comprehensive plan, and the zoning resolution is not a well-considered plan. Environmental review is certainly insufficient, but the same thing about ULURP applies to environmental review, right? We're debating the displacement characterizations in seeker, and we should reform that, but we're doing that because that's essentially the only place in the city of New York where displacement is being discussed in terms of real policy. We have an opportunity with the Where We Live process, but it's not wide enough to tackle it. So if there's one thing that the commission addresses, it would be this dearth, this vacuum around comprehensive planning. 197A plans should not be advisory, and actually plans in general shouldn't be advisory. DCP says we're doing these incredible plans to accompany the rezonings that are in places studies, and yet it's unclear to me what standing those plans actually have. If the commitments in those plans aren't listed in the tracker bill, there isn't actually any systematic way to go back and check and see if those things happen, or to see how other things displace it. And this disadvantages us on the state level as well, right? There's an example happening right now in the South Bronx where there was a tremendous planning process that was done by the city, and now the state is proposing something substantially different in terms of a highway plan, and there isn't any actual standing for that plan. So we need to strengthen community-based planning and planning at the same time. And I will submit more in terms of firmer recommendations in writing. So thank you.
Thank you. Adrian Weepkin.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Adrian Weipkin. I'm a staff attorney at the Community Development Project in the Equitable Neighborhoods practice. We work with directly impacted communities to support their efforts to dismantle racial, economic, and social oppression. And in particular, we work with communities to respond to city planning processes and private developers and make sure that the folks who have lived in neighborhoods for a long time aren't pushed out in the name of progress. So I have little to add to the excellent recommendations you've already heard from the remainder of the panelists, all of whom are very seasoned planners, which I am not. But I do want to offer some perspective from the work that CDP does with community-based organizations and low-income communities of color around the city, many of which have become the targets of neighborhood rezonings and next-generation neighborhoods development on nature campuses, and sort of to offer the perspective of why it's so essential to support the recommendations that the panelists have spoken about, in particular, the need for transparency in the pre-ULURP process and clear timelines, support for community-based planning, which is most certainly not the Department of DCP, is not DCP's mandate and not what they do, and also to ensure that there are ways to allow communities to have a meaningful voice in the process without that devolving into NIMBYism and segregation and the ugly forms of local control. As I mentioned, we have done a lot of work along with Elena and others on this panel on in communities that are being rezoned by the city. And the reason it is so essential to have independent support for planning within the communities is that when the city comes to do a neighborhood rezoning process, that is not a process that is initiated by the community almost ever. And it is a process that is in furtherance of a goal that the city has set citywide that may be a worthy goal. I think many of us on this panel really disagree that the answer to the affordability crisis is to just make more housing, but to the extent that the plan is designed to create more affordable housing, that is a goal that many of my clients share. But because the orientation of the plan is to say, essentially, the de Blasio administration says we have 300,000 units of affordable housing that we have to build or preserve. They have set a goal that is based on the number of units. That is not a goal that was set by the most directly impacted communities. It is not a goal that is supported by anyone in the affordable housing communities or tenant organizing communities that I work with, nor any of the people that it purports to benefit. But be that as it may, that is the goal that has been set. So the driver of neighborhood rezonings, to a great extent, is helping to meet that goal. And that is also true of plans to develop infill projects on NYCHA land, where, again, the city plans with NYCHA to build on between 80 and 100 NYCHA campuses around the city. NYCHA housing is, of course, like one of the main sources of deeply affordable housing in the city, and also a largely Black and brown population that does not have its needs met and will not have its needs met by the program that is being proposed. So in the face of all of that, my clients have an unending amount of optimism that I honestly respect them for tremendously, because in many cases, they and their families have been displaced by previous planning processes, be they rezonings of neighborhoods such as Williamsburg or earlier iterations of urban renewal. I have clients who now live in the South Bronx who are displaced from Harlem as a result of urban renewal processes. As Elena was alluding to, the issues with the highways in the South Bronx that have been going on for quite a long time. And we also have clients who were displaced by various Robert Moses projects to build highways. So all of our clients have witnessed over and over the city initiating planning processes that, from the perspective of the city, seemed like a really excellent idea, and almost always are advanced by white planners who think they have really great ideas for the low-income communities of color that they want to go in and fundamentally change. So despite all of this extremely negative history that our clients are very aware of from their personal experiences, from being great historians of the city in many cases, still and yet they engage in the city's formal ULURP process in every possible way that they can, and then some. So they send letters to agencies before the process even starts, outlining what they want. They make their own community plans in hopes that that is going to influence what the city does. They turn out in droves to every single hearing, and as Tom was pointing out, at least all of the hearings that I've been in, if it was any sort of voting process based on what community members say that they want, not one of the neighborhood rezonings that the administration has advanced would have passed. And they do all of that. I'm sorry?
1 minute.
Okay. This is just to say that the supports for community planning are absolutely essential too, because there is nothing worse for democracy than when people actually go to the process and participate, and they turn out in droves and they do absolutely everything they can, only to, at the end of it, say that was just a waste of my time. And there is a real opportunity to make it not a waste of people's time if they know that the chicken is not cooked when it is put in the oven already. Like, if they can have an opportunity to participate in the earlier portions of the planning, if the city is required to disclose several different options when it is proposing a neighborhood rezoning, not here's what we're presenting, take it or leave it, which is by and large what has happened, but instead, here is one version of what we think, and here's why. And we understand that you all have different goals, so here is what that would look like, and here are the impacts of that alternative. There is some very inadequate version of this in the city's environmental review process, but it comes way too late to allow anyone to meaningfully consider which of these alternatives would meet the goals of the community more. In my waning 10 seconds, I also want to make a quick pitch for NYCHA development. All NYCHA development to be subject to ULURP. At the moment, some of the development that takes place on NYCHA campuses is not subject to the ULURP process, which completely disfranchises NYCHA residents in the process. There have been a lot of recommendations on land use, as you've heard throughout the day. That is a relatively simple one that would make a huge impact, because again, the city is planning on doing between 80 and 100 infill projects around the city to build something like 10,000 units of affordable housing that will have a huge impact on NYCHA residents. Today, many of them have absolutely no say in the matter, and their council members don't either, and the borough president doesn't either. And that is something that could be addressed by the commission.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me tell you what my problem is and what our problem is. We are supposed to put something clear and concrete before the voters. You know, we're not decision makers here. We're here to determine what it is, the issues that you think should be addressed in a revision of the city charter. And if you have the opportunity or are so inclined, maybe you can go back and send us something that will help us to digest, better understand what your positions are about what we can do about land use with what are going to be relatively minor changes in the city charter. Remember, you don't want to go into the voting booth and have to review 3-page referenda that this planning commission put before you. So we have a tough job. And while we have been persuaded by many of your comments, I'm not so sure we understand how to put them before the voters. One question I have is actually of David Karnofsky, because either I missed it or you didn't say it, but there have been lots of issues around or disappointment or dissatisfaction with something called the pre-ULURP process. Can you take a minute to tell me what it is?
Okay. The pre-ULURP process is fundamentally about doing two things from an applicant standpoint, whether it's a city applicant or a private applicant. And then I'll talk a bit about the interaction with stakeholders during that same period. It's about preparing the application and preparing the environmental review, getting everything in order to the point where it's ready for public review.
There are no time limits for this.
Well, there were no time limits for a long period of time, and there were lots of complaints. And the Department of City Planning, towards the end of the Bloomberg administration, promulgated some rules that were designed to systematize this whole process and create not absolute timelines, but cycles of review within the department to try to ensure timely response by the department to submissions by applicants. So for example, if you prepare a draft application or a draft environmental review document, you submit it to the department comments on it, sends it back within a period of time, and you go through an iterative process to the point where the department says, this is complete and ready for review. So there is no absolute timeline. No one can say it takes only this number of months, but there is a sequence that's followed, and it's standardized now. And the intention of the department was to create some order in this process that didn't exist before. And I think it's been relatively successful. The overall timelines are still long, but there is more certainty about how you do it, what steps you have to go through, who you have to talk to, and all of that sort of thing. I think what was discussed by others here has more to do with what's going on between an applicant, particularly a private applicant perhaps, but also the department, I suppose, on area-wide rezonings during that time period in terms of interaction with the community, with the local electeds, the community board, and so forth and so on. That interaction takes place. What you heard is dissatisfaction about some aspects of that. But I'll tell you from the point of view of private applicants, those who do not engage in that kind of consultation are making a huge mistake, and they don't typically do it. They're never advised to ignore those parties because you can't go into the EULA process and expect to come out with any form of success if you haven't touched base and had those discussions. Now, the transparency of that process is something that Professor Angadi has talked about and written about, and those are some potential questions and issues. But it takes place because applicants want to improve their proposals and better assure that they will get support when the process is actually launched. So that does take place, whether it be a community board or local civics or the council member or the borough president. The city, Department of City Planning obviously does the same thing in its own way. So that's that whole chunk of time.
That helps. Other commission members have questions? Renata?
So I was also interested in the pre-ULERT process, and I wonder if Professor Angadi, if you could share with us some very concrete recommendations for increasing transparency. And I also wonder, while I have the mic, if any of you, any of the panelists could comment on the Office of Community-Based Planning that was recommended by Moses, if that could be an opportunity to address some of the recommendations that you shared. And that second question is for really anybody.
Yes. I would suggest an Office of Community-Based Planning should exist, but not within the City Planning Department as it exists today. In fact, there was at one time a community planning office. It did not really engage with neighborhoods and communities, didn't have the resources, the capacity, nor did it have the administrative support that is needed in 59 community districts. So I think it should be, the problem is the Department of City Planning is misnamed. It's a zoning department. They do zoning, they don't do planning. I think the biggest single reform could be a charter requirement that every ULURP action be consistent with a 197A plan, with a community-based plan, and a community-based plan that is also done with the support, financial, technical support of city government in different agencies. Every zoning should be based on a well-considered plan. In fact, the state constitution requires that. Unfortunately, we have an historic blank here. The city planning department considers the zoning resolution to be a well-considered plan. It is not. It's a regulatory mechanism for controlling building size, height, use, and so forth. But people in communities want real planning. They want to know 10 years from now, are we going to have enough school seats? 10 years from now, are we going to have better health services? These are our problems. Our problems aren't that we need more housing only. We have so many different problems. That's what planning is. So I would say 197A, Section 197A of the city charter was revised in 1989 specifically to allow, and it was a response to community-based organizations that were doing their own plans. And it specifically allowed them to do their plans, be considered by the City Planning Commission, and voted on. Well, since then, there have been only 17 approved. And Ron and I know, because we've worked with many of the neighborhoods and communities, they've stopped doing them. Why? Because the City Planning Department votes on them, approves them, and then they store them and they put them on a shelf. It's the classical planning problem. They ignore them. And so I'd say making that a requirement and making it a hard requirement in the charter, and also clarifying the language on having a professional city planner for each community.
You want to comment? Yeah, I do. First of all, to your quick point before, I've submitted my written testimony, but I appended to it a set of recommendations, which I generally would like you to review, and I think they make sense. And you'll have to simplify them in some way so they could be put on a ballot. I agree very much with the fact that we need some form of community-based planning in the city of New York. However, we have to be careful because once we mandate it, a 197A plan that becomes actual law, it also has to go through an environmental review process, and it needs the resources by which to be able to make that go through the process. So we might wind up with having that as a law, but if there isn't the resources to pay for the environmental impact statement, it just becomes moot. And I think it really is important to do that. The other thing is we really have to get to the root of the environmental impact analysis. What we do is now the reason that there's so much time spent in the pre-planning phase is that because all of the environmental considerations are done once a developer or the city has the idea of a project they want. And it's a project that's already fixed in their mind. And so they go about doing it. Planning is setting down the principles you want, developing the framework that you want to achieve, and then you develop the projects. So to my mind, the environmental impact statement is at the end of the pipe, not at the front. It should guide. It should be the principles by which a plan are developed. No displacement, no environmental adverse effects, a whole variety of other issues. Once you do that, then you make it predictable for the developer, and the community has a say up front. What we do now is the developer comes in, and I represented the community and worked with Community Board 9 and David was on the other side of the fence around the Columbia University expansion. And so all we could do is work around what those developers had proposed, as opposed to saying we wanted to allow Columbia to expand into the community rather than take over the community. And these are the principles we wanted to achieve. But it came after. It came after Columbia developed their plans, after they spent thousands upon thousands of dollars. So what they did is they brought in a whole barrage of attorneys, and the only person who had any background in planning was myself and many of the community board members. And it was, 1 against 100 and 1 against 1,000,000. And I think it really is important that we revisit how we do the environmental impact analysis, that it has got to be a framework within a given area so it's predictable rather than responding to each individual developer who comes along. Dr. Clark.
My question is going to go directly to Mr. Schiffman because I know him throughout my whole life in Brooklyn. And I just wanted you to explain not only Myrtle Avenue in Brooklyn and how that became alive, as well as Community Board 9 in Brooklyn, Rogers Avenue, and what kind of input you had, and if we were going to put something on the ballot in a statement to make sure that community fully participate, what would it be?
Well, if I know exactly what you're talking about, I think it boils down to the fact.
Pratt and Rooney Bryant, as well as Horace Williams, worked with you.
Absolutely. I think what happened in every case, and including we hoped it would occur in Williamsburg and with Tom and Red Hook and other places, is when you really work directly with the people. People want to see development. They want to see change. They want to see economic development surrounding their area. That's the jobs. It creates the base for them. But they want to see that community develop in a way that is accountable to them, so that the opportunities that are made available allow them to grow. We worked with the people on Rogers Avenue. We worked on Myrtle Avenue. We worked with the Flatbush Development Corporation to develop plans that came out of the neighborhood. We worked with the folks in Bed-Stuy that gave root to the first community development corporation in the country. There are now 7,000 of those. That's because we didn't know anything until we met and worked directly with the people. The relationship between working with the professional, working with the community, creates a new entity, and that new entity understands the nature of what the plans that are necessary. And once the community buys in and has the power and the capability to pursue the goals of their plan, even if it takes 10 or 15 years, they do it. So it took a long time for Myrtle Avenue to revitalize after the L came down. It took a lot for Rogers Avenue after the 1973, whatever it was, blackout to come back. People worked at it day in, day out. The problem in every community that we're working in is that their success is now being used to allow other developers to come in that are now pushing the people out of the neighborhood. The success of the communities that saved the city is that they're now being displaced by that same energy that revitalized neighborhood after neighborhood. CHPC and others in 1983 said New York City would be a city of 5.3 million. Today we're closer to 9 million. And what we need to do is not go by the planned shrinkage policies that some promoted early on in the mid-80s, and I don't mean to blame you on that track. But what is the vision that we want for the residents that are living here, for the new immigrants that are coming into the city? They see the city as a place of opportunity. And what we're doing is stealing away that opportunity by thinking the only way we grow is by importing people from other places. We have to think about how we invest in the people who live in this city, who've immigrated to this city, who are here, rather than trying to attract, the new creative class to the city. We need policies that invest in our city rather than others, and that's what the people of each of those communities that you're referring to worked on, and that's how they educated us.
I think that's the right point to close this session. My thanks to all of you. It's been very instructive. As you can tell, we're trying to learn as much as we can so that at the end of the day, we can put something before the voters in November. And we are very, very pleased by your presentation. Thank you all very much. Yeah, and